It is the Anglophone world that is responsible for a whole school of philosophy that assumes that a technical, abstract, decontextualizing, dissevering approach to life will disclose its true essence, rather than a phenomenological approach to life as it is experienced. Such an analytic approach reveals not embodied, embedded, situated Gestalten, that is to say, wholes that cannot be taken apart without often profound loss, but mere fragments. Now, these differences between theory and experience, between the general and the unique, between what is abstract and what is embodied, between what can be made explicit and what must forever remain implicit if it is not to become a travesty of itself, are at the heart of the difference between the two brain hemispheres. I can't unpack either the science or the multitude of philosophical implications of this, but for those who want to get the full picture, I have done my best in a disgracefully long book called The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of the World. Here I must content myself with the merest outline. It turns out that the foundational difference lies in the nature of the attention each hemisphere pays to the world. This has a clear evolutionary purpose. For all creatures, the ultimate survival conundrum is how to eat while at the same time not being eaten. For the first, what is needed is narrow beam, highly focused, piecemeal attention to a familiar detail targeted for its use. For the second, the exact opposite, broad, open, sustained, vigilant attention to everything else that's going on in the world without preconception as to what it might be. Since this is impossible to achieve in just one neuronal mass, the solution adopted by all creatures with brains is to have two such masses, each capable of disposing its consciousness towards the world in a quite different way. But that evolutionary account is only the very beginning, since attention is no small thing. Indeed, attention changes the world. How you attend determines what it is you will find, and what you find determines the kind of attention you will pay in the future. Thus it is that two distinct experiential worlds, each internally coherent, but at least superficially incompatible, are brought into being for us by our two brain hemispheres. What are those worlds like? In one, that of the left hemisphere, we know and recognize what is familiar, certain, fixed, a collection of isolated fragments or parts, things that are explicit, decontextualized, disembodied, and meaningless, abstract, general in nature, and lifeless, but useful. What matters here is quantity, not quality. All is both fungible and reproducible. What is experienced is a representation, a two-dimensional version of the world, a schema, a theoretical model, and it is, like a map, vastly simpler than the world that is mapped. That is not a weakness in a map, but a strength. But obviously, we must be careful not to mistake the map for the world in which it is given to us to live. In the other world, that of the right hemisphere, nothing is ever completely certain or wholly predictable, and we are always alert to the possibility that there could be something new here. Where the left hemisphere aims to close down to a certainty, the right hemisphere opens up to a possibility. What looks fixed in the left hemisphere is seen to be part of a continuous flow in the right. Everything here is connected and essentially relational. Where there were only parts, there are now wholes, Gestalten. Here, the implicit matters at least as much as the explicit, and everything is understood in terms of the context in which it is situated. This is a world composed of unique things, not general types. It is animate, and in it things are not just represented, but truly present to us, adopting a Heideggerian term. They're not just passively there, but actually coming into being for us through our encounter with them. Obviously, barring accidents, both our hemispheres are working and need to be working in tandem. So I expect many people might say that all this is very well, but why should they care where certain types of experience are brought about in the brain? But that is to overlook something I believe to be both exciting and important. Because the two worldviews mediated by the two hemispheres are, strictly speaking, logically incompatible, when it comes to formulating an understanding of what we humans are, what we're doing here, and what the nature of the cosmos might be, in other words, when we begin to philosophize, we tend, in order to be consistent, to rely on one or other of these hemisphere viewpoints, not both. Only relatively rarely do we succeed in synthesizing them. This leads to what have traditionally been seen as irresoluble debates about the nature of reality. And over 2,500 years of Western history are littered with such disputes between schools. It would seem the choice one ultimately makes must be determined by nothing better than personal inclination. But I suggest to you that this is not where things need to end. We can now definitively say that the left hemisphere is not, as people used to think, the reliable and dependable one. Indeed, the opposite is the case. Not only does the right hemisphere attend better, but it is also superior to the left hemisphere in perception, which is of course not the same thing as attention, and far better at forming reliable judgments on the basis of what it has attended to and perceived. Delusions are so much commoner when the reality-orientating influence of the right hemisphere is impaired that the left hemisphere has been described by several neuroscientists as frankly delusional, a conclusion with which I concur. In The Matter with Things, I look at some 25 of the most extraordinary and bizarre neuropsychiatric disorders involving delusional syndromes, and in all but one case, the lesion responsible is either always or much more commonly found to be in the right hemisphere, not the left. Additionally, the right hemisphere is not only more emotionally and socially intelligent than the left hemisphere, but actually more cognitively intelligent. Good old-fashioned IQ is more dependent on the right hemisphere than on the left. And in cases where people show a drop in IQ following a brain insult of some kind, that insult is far more commonly to be found in the right hemisphere than in the left. Now, all this may sound unlikely and unbalanced. Why should the right hemisphere have such a marked advantage? But if you think about it, this would naturally follow from the differing evolutionary roles they have developed to fulfill. So important is the ability to grasp things, pin them down, and have power over them, that while in the left hemisphere comprehension is poorer, the faculty of apprehension, grasping onto something, is clearly superior. This explains its control of the right hand, with which the majority of us literally grasp hold of the world so as to manipulate it, and its dominance for those aspects of language, not all of language, with which we say we've grasped something or pinned it down. But the left hemisphere has for millions of years, remember, not just human brains, but all brains have this structure, ceded comprehension of the whole to its counterpart on the right. So we know that one hemisphere at least tends to be more reliable, less prone to be deluded. In a word, a better guide to reality than the other. The left hemisphere has a role in making us powerful manipulators, but it cannot make us wise. There is a vast body of neuropsychological literature which I've reviewed in The Matter with Things that confirms this to be the case. Now, clearly, even that revelation would be of rather little practical use if we could not simultaneously have a very good idea of which hemisphere's world picture we were encountering in any one situation. But we can. We can see the hallmark or characteristic imprint of either hemisphere on different ways of thinking. This means that we can say with a degree of confidence that one way of looking at the world is, other things being equal, more likely to be on the path to truth than the other. This is surely a step forward for both philosophy and science. Don't get me wrong, there's no problem with the left hemisphere as long as it remains firmly under the guidance of the right. But since it knows so much less than the right, it is prone to imagine it knows it all. I think you know people like that, and tends to become headstrong. Though a helpful servant, it is a very poor master. Interestingly, there are myths from round the world that speak of two powers that should cooperate, but come through the resentment of the inferior party to be at loggerheads. Two rivalrous brothers, an emperor and his general, a master and his emissary. And ultimately, if the quarrel is not resolved, the world falls to ruin. It was this that led me to choose the title, The Master and His Emissary, for my first book-length exploration of the philosophical significance of hemisphere difference. And in the second part of that book, I consider the main turning points in the history of ideas in the West, from the ancient Greeks all the way through to postmodernism, looking specifically at the way in which that civilizational turn reflected a balance or imbalance between the contributions of the hemispheres. In summary, what I found is that there is a pattern repeated at least 3 times in Greece, in Rome, and in our own civilization since the Renaissance, whereby there is a sudden upwelling, an efflorescence of creative life and beauty, accompanied by great advances in both the arts and sciences, in which the appropriate balance between the hemispheres is achieved. And then, overall, though with at times temporary corrections, a decline as the civilization moved further and further towards the dominance of the left, always the left, and the subtlety and insight that had been achieved is lost, and in one case was lost for nearly 1,000 years. I imagine you will have little difficulty in recognizing the stigmata of left hemisphere domination in our culture. Amongst the most obvious are neglect of the broader picture, the replacement of understanding by information, and the complete abandonment of ideas of skill, judgment, and wisdom, the loss of concepts that are human, contextual, nuanced, not programmatic, abstract, and rule-bound. The rise of what Jacques Ellul called technique, the totality of rationalized methods aiming for absolute efficiency in every field, including politics, education, and human behavior. And with all this, bureaucracy, a cancer that has spread everywhere and continues to leach the lifeblood of the organism it was supposed to serve, the hospital or the university, in cases that may be close to your heart and are close to mine. The loss of uniqueness, a much neglected virtue of all life as opposed to the machine. Henry Thoreau said, "No 2 blades of grass are the same." The triumph of quantity over quality, the rise of either-or, black and white ways of thinking, the loss of reasonableness, which can only come from experience, a failure of that all too uncommon thing today, common sense, an obsession with control while being completely unwilling to take responsibility. I could go on for a long time, but I won't. I believe the mushrooming of bureaucracy and the sudden eruption of AI into our lives are the most obvious examples of the externalization of the left hemisphere ways of thinking into our environment and its most audacious bid for domination yet. They recognize only one value, the lowest of all, that of mere utility and power. Both are driven towards and issue in the fettering of human freedom and creativity, and lead to the disengagement of human lives and loves from the traditional centers of our loyalty, which are not only overlooked, but actively excluded in this vision of things. AI, in particular, promises us freedom, as do all seductive tyrannies. Once again, we appear to have forgotten a myth, that of the serpent and the apple. Whether Steve Jobs recognized it or whether the archetype spoke to him unconsciously, I don't know. The ultimate goal of modern man is to be himself, unfettered from all bonds. But everything that gives meaning to our lives is, under this left hemisphere's view, seen as a constraint from which technocracy will free us. Yet it is through constraint alone that we can be free, or create anything that is good, beautiful, and true. We cast off the bonds, for the very word too embodies the paradox to which I wish to draw attention, the bonds that unite us to family, friends, and community, the bonds we have with nature that gave birth to us, and the bonds we feel with the sacred, all that fulfills us and set us free to be truly ourselves. We reject the service in which we could have found perfect freedom, and as though hypnotized, we embrace the fetters of the machine. Behind all this is a morally bankrupt and intellectually simplistic philosophy, that of reductive materialism. And so, of course, it is good when people adopt what they call a more spiritual approach, and I do not in the least decry it. But I think we will not survive without something more substantial, something more embodied and embedded in the deep structure of life, something importantly not just personal, but shared. In short, we must return to the spiritual roots of this civilization. We have been living for some time in what might be thought of as the afterglow of Christianity. There were the usual gestures of a respectful kind in its direction, while in practice it was considered by many a dispensable anachronism. But while we still had the effects of the extraordinary change rendered in a civilization by Christianity, we thought that all was well. It moved out of the realm of lived experience, Christianity that is, into that of a perfectly acceptable theory for those who like that sort of thing, peripheral rather than, as it truly must be, central to our shared lives. The full extent of what we in truth owe to it is only now being realized as all the customary decencies we took for granted fall away. Without some return to religion, there is not enough there to provide the needed structure and support for both the moral life and the life of the spirit. Our house is built on sand, and as the rain descends and the floods come, and they will, and the winds blow, and they will, and beat upon that house, it will fall, and great will be the fall thereof. I started today from the idea that we urgently need something to lead us out of the shallows back into the depths, out of the two-dimensional world of the abstract and theoretical into the full-bloodedness of embodied life. Myths are embodied insights into the nature of being. In ancient Greece, mythos, from which we get our word myth, was considered the source of the greater truths and more important than logos, which was appropriate to the pragmatic mode of thought that enabled people to function effectively in daily life in the world. In hemisphere terms, mythos was aimed at intuitive and imaginative integration of an understanding, the concern of the right hemisphere, while logos was aimed at utility and power to manipulate the world, the concern of the left hemisphere. Christianity is, I believe, the greatest of all myths, a word I use without any implication that it is not true, indeed, quite the opposite. And something it expresses better than any other I know is the beauty dignity, and pathos of the soul's embodiment in this world. Ordinary language cannot reveal to us what is divine, which utterly transcends everyday language. Language was developed for purposes of utility, enabling people to share an understanding of the steps to be taken in a practical task. Language refuses God, and God refuses language, unless it is the language of poetry, a kind of language that undermines language itself in order to reach somewhere deeper. Poetry is the language of the divine and of all that affects us deeply. And that is why the language of ritual must work at the level of poetry if it is not to lead us astray. The Christian mythos centers on the embodiment of the divine in a living and suffering world. What the Church offers us is a treasure house of embodied meaning that our souls can turn to for sustenance. It incarnates the sacred in a narrative or mythos, stores it for us in ways that can be accessed through ritual and through the language of poetry and above all music, as well as through art and icons and the beauty of an architecture that provides a tangible instantiation of all of this. It is not that they do not speak to one's emotions and intellect, but that they transcend any such terms. It is to the soul that they speak. They make the things we otherwise can only talk about palpably real. The great embodied treasure house of the divine has a counterpart, of course, in the lives and deeds of the saints as they are passed down to us, as great exemplar of what a human being can be. They speak to us of what our best nature can offer. And here I would include in all those unnamed and unremembered saints whose lives spoke of their beliefs in the performance of selfless and compassionate actions, sometimes at very great cost even of their lives. As Pope Benedict XVI reflected, the only really effective apologia for Christianity comes down to two arguments, namely the saints the Church has produced and the art which has grown in her womb. All this language, that is importantly so much more than language, is also importantly shared with others across time and space and down through generations, finding its way into the very fabric of everyday life. While it is a wonderful thing for people to find their own spiritual path, I fear that we need more than good intentions and private spiritual experience if we are to survive. If this civilization is to be saved, and we all know how urgent that need is, there must be more. Nothing less than a return to the place of the Christian tradition at the core of life, daily life. I don't know how likely this is. However, the signs are that people, particularly perhaps young people, are realizing the bankruptcy of the materialist position and are seeking more nourishing sustenance. Part of this is to do with the absolutely core insight that this is not a world of things, but a world of relations. Over the last 100 years, the reality of this has been emphasized in modern physics, of all places. This is, as the great physicist John Archibald Wheeler put it, a participatory universe. That means that our consciousness makes a difference to what happens. This is part of a reimagining of the world that I have elaborated in part 3 of The Matter with Things, and is one of the 3 ways in which the title of that book can be read. We believe the world is made up of things, but as I argue, things are secondary to relations. Relations come before relata. There is a vast body of psychological research which shows that it is relationships with one another, bonded by shared values and beliefs, our relationship with nature, and our relationship with the divine cosmos that constitute the 3 great factors that give meaning, health, and fulfillment to life. In their absence, we suffer and fail. If you wanted to destroy a people, you teach them to be alienated from their past and careless of the future. that self is everything, and all factors that tend to limit total freedom are to be scorned and rejected, that societal traditions and loyalties are nothing more than inconvenient trammels. You would extract them from and alienate them from nature in all her forms, nature out of which we are born and to which we return. You would teach them that only simple people adhere to a religious tradition and way of life. The predictable consequences of this would be massive increases in existential anxiety, hopelessness, depression, and pathological self-absorption, in which all the deep causes of human fulfillment would have been cut off. As Emerson put it already in the 1830s, man has become the dwarf of himself. Self-respect, and I do not mean self-esteem, a much overrated quality, has been eroded by mass society in all the ways so trenchantly identified by Hannah Arendt. And recently we have been relentlessly dragooned into a belief that we are inefficient machines. Yuval Noah Harari calls us hackable animals and recommends we should get used to the idea and even embrace it. In January this year, he spoke to Davos, to the World Economic Forum. Artificial intelligence is the new master of words, he said. It will take over language, law, and power. Most of the world of the mind will originate in a machine. AI has coined a new word for humans, the watchers, the passive lookers-on. AI machines can lie better than humans, said he. And he was right. Low self-respect leads to moral degeneracy, deceitfulness, selfishness, lower achievement levels, and addiction. This is where I believe we now are, and we need to rediscover all that our right hemisphere at a deeper level knows, but which we are now taught to disattend to and disregard. The right hemisphere alone has that capacity to understand the depths of meaning required by those who would approach the ideals on which anciently Western civilization was founded, Plato's the good, the true, and the beautiful. And I would add, at the pinnacle of all, the sacred. Without this wiser understanding, human life is already over. But life can be snatched from the jaws of death. We matter, and there is hope. That too is the Christian story. Thank you. Thanks.
Good morning, and really thank you for that, Ian. That was wonderful. And I've been spoken through just a couple of things to say. My brain doesn't really either left or right hemisphere function before about midday, and in honour of Pusey House, I left London at 6 this morning. So please forgive me if this makes no sense whatsoever, either in a utilitarian, deontological, or virtue ethics tradition. But I'd like to talk about a couple of things flowing from Ian's paper. I'd like to talk about tragedy, the fact that we are living in this tragic time, and this is completely incomprehensible to the progressive mind. Remember, the least true thing you ever heard in your life was things can only get better. It's worth dwelling on that at every level. It's completely wrong at every level, and yet it can't understand why it's wrong. And so what you have, so you could say, Ian, that I was politically formed very much in the left hemisphere. I think that's one way of putting it. And the horror of that, which was, you mentioned in passing Leninism, but that's one part of it. Maoism is, but the worst of it all were the Fabians, you know. And it's really worth looking at the account of Malcolm Muggeridge of the journey to Ukraine during the Holodomor, where hands are scraping down the window with people dying. And Beatrice Webb turns to Malcolm Muggeridge and said, "Isn't it wonderful here?" That's also the power in theoretical terms of ideology to make things invisible. So I just want to pick up on those points. Just a minor matter of dissent. In the English language, we have knowledge, we have wisdom, we have understanding. In the Bible, it's in Hebrew, it's chokhmah bina das, wisdom, understanding and knowledge. We also have apprehension. I refuse to surrender any form of wisdom to the French. And that's not just merely a trivial point, because obviously the whole concept of revolution is a left hemisphere psychopathic delusion. The idea that you can sever memory, that there is an entirely new beginning. The fact that people do not exist, the great phrase, I think you used it 3 times, was embedded and embodied. What revolution does is try to disrupt and entirely destroy that embeddedness and that embodiedness, and that absolutely is the reason, and I speak here as a Jew, that why in politics Christ is king, because he was the embodied and embedded reality that couldn't be killed even though he was crucified. The memory of him and his story lingers. So this whole concept of revolution is fundamental, I think, to the left-sided dominion, the utilitarian dominion. All that was wrong with social democracy dominion was if you had the perfect administration of things. And when I say about tragedy, I understand this government as a tragic government, a government incapable of understanding what is wrong with it, who doubles down on administrative methods, on legal orders, which cannot understand Labour itself as a tradition that gave human form in an absolutely desiccated utilitarian world during industrialization. So what you have is the constant desecration and retreat from your own tradition, because you can't even understand what a tradition is, and everything becomes about the immediate crisis that you happen to find yourself in, which further undermines any notion of what you were talking about, Ian, which was first of all that people have a memory. You started off that can delineate between better and worse. I don't know if you came across McIntyre's essay, Epistemological Crisis, Dramatic Narrative and the History of Science. But it's really complementary to what you're talking about. Alistair McIntyre was talking about how storytelling is absolutely necessary to paradigm changes in the history of science. And really, but one can be better than the other. And the reason we know that this government is absolutely useless is because some of us have some memory of Labour governments, this is obviously before 97, that weren't entirely useless. And I think that drew upon some tradition and instinctive and intuitive understanding that the dignity of the human being was challenged by the state as well as the market. The market wishes to turn you just into a commodity. The state wishes to turn you just into an administrative unit. And that the genius of our ancient constitution and of Labour was to defy that dehumanisation through relationships, through concepts like solidarity, that I think are so important. So that's why I'm going to concentrate on the political dimension of what you're saying, how normal paradigm ever since really, I consider that really nothing has been good since 1979. That's roughly my approach to life, that all due respect to the Danube Institute, but she was a shocking utilitarian, Margaret Thatcher, and really not a conservative at all. She was a radical Whig who gave no articulation to the conservative notion of continuity and embeddedness, and every notion to the avariciousness of the market. And in fact, what was sacred in our country was often privatized and sold off, and now we see the logic of that. I don't know if you've noticed, sometimes I think that people don't really care, but they're trying to abolish trial by jury. This is one of the, which is a kind of Magna Carta situation. Like, you know, we've got to get rid of the Magna Carta for financial and administrative reasons. And it's a very, very left hemisphere kind of approach. And, you know, sometimes you hear things when you're in Parliament and you can't quite believe you're hearing them. And I said, well, what are you doing that for? And the answer I got was that the courthouses were privatised under Thatcher. And also under Blair, of course. Okay, so just the view, there is no difference between Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. This is fundamental. What she mercilessly initiated, Tony Blair immaculately consummated, but not in a sacred or religious way. And so they sold off the courthouses, which were the only places that had the rooms necessary for jury trial, now luxury flats, apartments, and office space. And so basically I was told, well, there's nowhere to have the jury. That's where it all leads. As you put it so beautifully, loneliness and emptiness is the end point of all of this, because they don't understand that relationship and tradition is the foundation of life, not an impediment to the fulfillment of life. This is what I really took from your, so they really got everything completely the wrong way around. And so it ends with the desecration of our ancient liberties in the name of efficiency. But that's the logic, because if you see the fulfillment of things as the emancipation from all obligation, relationship, tradition, relationship, and love, then the answer is mental illness and the abolition of jury trial. They kind of go together. And this is where I want to talk about exactly what you said, that mythos, that the ability to tell a story, and a plausible story, a story that's superior to other stories, is the absolute foundation of sanity. So what we have with left hemispheric domination, the administrative methods, what I call, it's interesting, people's memory, the lanyard class. This whole thing about the lanyard class, if people understand it, compliance, subordination, and the total subordination to a managerial abstract. That's the problem with the French Revolution, is that equality, liberty, they only added fraternity in 1848, you know, and it didn't work out. And so what you have is a world dominated by procedure, abstract nouns, and the conformity to that, rather than embedded and embodied traditions and people, which is, of course, why it is that Christianity is sublime politically. And I'll kind of finish on that before, I don't know how long I've got, it's early yet, I could say more. But I just want to talk about something stupendous that is happening now, before I conclude in reflection on what you've said. And particularly I want to pick up the point about AI, where I think that there's another way of conceptualizing that. But we are living at this moment witnessing something completely inexplicable to the progressive mind, which is the restoration of monarchy in Iran. I just think we've got to understand where we are. It's just put up 3, you see, they're always Trinitarian here. It's always 3. I'll be very quick then. But just to say that we live in a monarchy. The ancient constitution is the fundamental framework through which we have flourished for at least 600 years in terms of stable, legitimate institutions. common law, parliament, monarchy, church. These things are now viewed, as you can see, as dispensable. So the trial by jury is all part of putting the law lords into the Supreme Court to disembody the fundamental institutions that are in relationship with one another: sovereignty, liberty, democracy. But what we are witnessing in Iran is precisely the memory of the Shah. The people remember when things were better. And I had the same experience when I went to Ukraine. I've been to Ukraine many times since the war started. And believe me, they're not going back to communism. They absolutely renounce it. And in Iran, it's overwhelming. 40,000 people, average age 26, were shot dead between the 8th and the 10th of January this year in Iran. It's a massacre, it's a slaughter. And yet, last night I saw again, Javid Shah, long live the king. They're walking again on the streets. And we as a constitutional, maybe the leading constitutional monarchy in the world, are not leading this. It looks like my government would prefer a republic. They don't grasp that the Shah embodies all of those traditions in Iran of grace, of beauty, of nobility, and without nobility there can be no good in politics. So I just first of all say that we are going to witness this. We will see the reverse Ayatollah, we will see the Shah of Iran arriving with 7-8 million. For those of my age, do you remember the Ayatollah arriving at Tehran airport? This is going to be the reverse of that. And whereas if we were guided correctly by our lived experience for the protection of liberty, for the security of democracy, the ability to change, we would cleave fanatically to the ancient constitution, to the monarchy, to the established church, to the common law. Please, I'm in the Labour Party, so applause makes me nervous. But all of this will go on outside the experience of our rulers. The Shah will return, the constitutional monarchy will be re-established, and yet it will be inexplicable to the left hemispheric administrators, rationalists, who prove that rationalism is absolutely no substitute for reason, and reason will include wisdom, experience, understanding, and comparative historical understanding. So, listen, Ian, can we have a chat about AI another time? I think I've run out of time. I'll just say that John Ruskin, William Morris, Frank Lloyd Wright as well, the arts and crafts and the machine, everybody thought that with industrialization it would be the death of the artisan, but in fact it led to an absolute renewal of artisan organization. If AI can do the mundane things, then what is uniquely human can flourish. I mean, we've just got to talk about that possibility as an institutional possibilities, and that will require the resurrection of certain traditions relating to vocation and a certain rejection of ideas regarding professionalization. But we can perhaps talk about that over a cigarette if you're prepared to come outside. So just to conclude, to genuinely conclude, I know I've exceeded the Trinity, but I've got religious reasons that I can get away with that. For me, what was memorable in what Ian just talked about was precisely that what is vital is relationship. To understand relationship in all its aspects, including conceptual. There's no one idea that is primary, whether that's equality or liberty. Also concepts hunt in families and have a relationship to each other. But through the idea that we are all sinners, through the idea that only together can we achieve grace and redemption, I think it's absolutely vital to remember that there is something sublime about our Christian inheritance as a political inheritance. Only Christianity as a religion has protected other religions. in the public square. This is something that I will always honour. As I say, as a Jew, I find my political redemption in the loving arms of Jesus, always will. And that particularly what we talked about last time, George, the Catholic inheritance is particularly important in relation to this because of its understanding about the revolutionary disruption of capital as well as the state. And those two, in the end, I would say that the truth is in paradox, that we have to learn to be paradoxical in the way that we approach, that the old is the new, that tradition shapes modernity. And so I really, although this morning when I woke up, I regretted accepting this invitation. I'm very pleased to be here now. Thank you.
We have been betrayed. But if we do not confess our complicity in betrayal, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. I want to focus in the next few minutes on betrayal and on loyalty. I believe that these permeating aspects of our experience provide an important focus for reflection on Christian revival and on political life. We might all want to consider now ways in which we have been betrayed, or have betrayed other people, or indeed ways in which we have been loyal. So I'm mindful that I'm following Ian's remarks, and I'm learning from Ian's work, though I suspect I remain very much in the foothills. However, I'll venture some thoughts which I hope will stimulate conversation, including correction from those who see things more clearly. Now, moving in interdisciplinary paths is quite risky, skating on thin ice. So doing so in our British and English political moments, which Maurice has alluded to, adds some further excitement. Doing interdisciplinary political work as relevant to revival, well, that requires faith in the living God. And mercifully, as Maurice reminded us in his Times column a few weeks ago, and just now, there is safety in the arms of Jesus. Now, Ian talks about ways of being in the world, and just now spoke about traditional centres of loyalty. A vital way of being in the world is to be loyal. Loyalty is a permeating feature of the world, somehow bound up with love, with longing, and with obligations. Loyalties coordinate, inspire, and focus various kinds of attention. Loyalty may be an admirable quality of people in relationship, including their relationship with God. But we shouldn't simply call loyalty a virtue. There are vicious loyalties. A renewal and reordering of loyalties is a vital element of renewal for politics, culture, and public life. Indeed, if there's to be a restoration of wisdom in politics, then our common life must deal in some way with the intertwined phenomena of loyalty and betrayal. Now, some might unthinkingly believe that talk of loyalty is necessarily connected to nativism and ethnocentrism. Put pejoratively, even pathologically, loyalties seem pandemic in the human condition. Vaccination is therefore a political project for some, and we've just heard a little bit about that. And some think that chief causes, or at least exacerbators, of our global polycrisis lie in religions. For religions, it seems, are laboratories of loyalty, out of which endlessly mutating mind viruses escape to devastating effect. To be mature on that view seems to require moving beyond the unwisely blinkered tradition visions which personal, national, or religious loyalties require. To be a far-sighted citizen of the world is to reject such blind loyalty, for blind loyalty prefers one God over another. And it fails to see that national borders are so arbitrary, so secured by the barbed wire of past and present evils, and so nurturing of national preference, as to be ill-fitted to serve a humane global future, a future filled instead with theory in the sense that we've just heard about. However, Loyalty to places, gods, people, nations, even political leaders is an ordinary feature of what it is to be human. It's no accident that loyalties permeate what we think, say, and do socially and politically. Loyalty is about something which is ours, something that belongs to a first-person plural, a land, England, a street, a business, a tradition, an ancestral faith, in Mary Harrington's phrase yesterday. A tradition handed down as a gift, as an inherited gift. An inheritance is like a home, passed down through generations into which we welcome others, including strangers, a gift which has now come into our care. Such loyalty, like its contrary betrayal, is a thing of immense power. It concerns what Marcus was speaking about yesterday in terms of the sacred, concerns awe and wonder, picking up on Esme's remarks, and again, Mary Harrington's attention to forms of community which meet many people's longing for a symbolic world. I was especially struck by her question, which I heard was, who will catechize the English? I think I heard you say yesterday. Loyalty is at the center of all these things. Loyalty and the longings which come with it need a sense of discipline, discipling, we should say. A renewal and reordering of loyalties, it seems to me, is an important element of renewal for politics, culture, and public life. Now, Ian distinguishes two interrelated worlds, a world in which there is betweenness and one where there is not. And it's especially that emphasis on betweenness that seems bound up with loyalty and betrayal, and thereby the possibility of revival. The right hemisphere, we learn, enables distance. Empathy, empathic attention arises in the betweenness, and the possibility of bonds between people follows. The creation of forms of that first-person plural, the we, you and me, us. But empathy is not enough. Empathy can serve hostility. Your enemies want to know just how you're feeling. But loyalty galvanizes individual empathic attention into first-person plural purpose. The Old Testament scriptures teach that loyalty is a permeating feature of the divine human, and human wider creation nested network of relations. We are one long participation in a universe woven through with divine presence and divine covenant. In creation, with Noah, with Israel, with David, when the people of God are at a low ebb, we are reminded in Hosea that it is Hesed, not sacrifice, that Yahweh desires. And concerning Hesed, the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks said that God lives in the between that joins self to self through an act of covenant kindness. Hesed then as the integrative interpersonal quality which should flow from God, within the people of God, and amongst those entering the kingdom of God. Christians believe that this Hesed is found decisively in Jesus Christ's blood of the new covenant, shed for many for the remission of sins. Now, if we're to follow Ian's analysis, we live here now in the aftermath of a long betrayal. The scales weighted against right hemispheric ways of being and in favor of left hemispheric ways of being. How is squeezed out by what? Just so, the emissary betrays his master. Betrayal impacts political and economic life, as Ian says. The imitation of beliefs and practices, ways of seeing the world and ways of being in the world favor one or another hemisphere. This session's abstract talks of economic reductionism, technocratic governance. John Milbank last week discussed the economic conditions which shape the changing stakes which different workers now have in economic and political life. Ian gives a long account of the betrayed life in the conclusion to the master and his emissary. But how might the opposite of the betrayal of the master by the emissary be described and given substance in service of the Christian revival? Loyalty of the emissary for the master will either be aided or hampered by the ways in which our cultural life, social and political relations are configured. Certain formations of life will tend to revive the rejoicing in the sacred gift of that wondrous, awe-filled understanding which the right hemisphere particularly offers. Perhaps a renewal of piety, as Andrew Davison said yesterday, that effervescence Ian just mentioned. If well ordered, the disciplines of ecclesial and political infrastructure set a kind of course within which loyalties run. Not in any way an individual creates and prefers, but according to an inherited order, which a people discover, can discover again, and cherish, and within which people find freedom. How will this happen? If we're to follow Ian, then revival involves people being drawn to what is new and emotionally engaging for them, right hemispheric forms of attention, opening up vistas of possible learning, new and engaging, even if and especially if that learning is deeply imbued with living tradition, with myth, by which our affections may be deepened and find proper objects of love. This requires participation and communion with loyal people in loyalty-inducing institutions, doctrinally imbued, affectively rich, cosmically and locally contextualized ways of informing attention. In this way, we can learn, again, what Mary spoke of, that rewriting of our inner algorithms. This requires flexibility, new kinds of integrative learning, change of mind, in a word, repentance, in that sense of turning to see the cosmos illuminated by Jesus Christ. So how might Christian re-enchantment of social and political life take form? The Persian Christians who we've been baptizing in Cowley, they are all for the Shah. They are for the Shah. Now, in Great Britain and Northern Ireland, multiple places remain in which well-formed loyalties can fill that betweenness of life, or alternatively, in which betrayal can take root and deepen. So Ian is adamant that art and religion should not become part of the betrayal. Andrew Davison touched on beauty and public art on the way to Cambridge Station yesterday, as you'll recall. As for religion, I recognise very much the humble place that the Church of England has in national life, discussed yesterday, the failures of doctrinal leadership, indeed heresy, which has bedevilled its life. We've heard from some of the Church of England's insipid milquetoast character, and Bishop Graham's response. And yet, what within the Reformed Catholic tradition of the Church of England, alongside other churches, will help to overcome the betrayals which we've suffered and the betrayals in which we've been complicit? The purpose of this institutional form of the Church of England is to enable attention upon Jesus Christ, who lights up our longing for wide horizons and guides focused reasoning and forms of attention in both hemispheres. In the book Bishop Graham and I have edited, A Voice in the Wilderness, Why Should We Listen to the Church of England?, coming out next month, I've argued for the Church of England's legitimacy as a witness to Christ in terms of its loyalty to its inheritance of faith, loyalty sustained through our interlocking covenants, including the coronation oath noted yesterday, through our rootedness in place by faith in Jesus Christ, especially in the parish, with faith as a root of loyalty, in that sense articulated by William Tyndale. And all aspects of human infrastructure may be responsive to this inheritance of faith, ecclesial, economic, national, familial, amicable. Our prayer for revival is for a renewal of life within institutional forms, that they might be in some way intermeshed with loyalties to Jesus Christ. Now, loyalty to a specific tradition cannot cohere with despising or hating that inheritance. Yet loyalty cannot be Christian loyalty if it is willfully blind about its inheritance and thus unable to distinguish between what is godly and ungodly. To be Christian, revival must keep in step with a spiritual renewal in that penitent relationality with God, which offers to suffuse right hemispheric development within and amongst a royal priesthood. I began by saying, we have been betrayed. We might all fill out some account of how we have been betrayed. Stay awake, Jesus tells us. Vigilance in that right hemispheric sense is required, whereby we can identify what constitutes a betrayal. Deciding what counts will be closely associated with some substantial account of the good, the true, the beautiful, the sacred. So when a senior politician or member of a royal family is accused of betrayal, is it sufficient to say that what was involved is a betrayal of UK PLC, that economic reductionism we disavow? The challenge for national revival is in part the difficulty which claims of betrayal run into in liberal democracies, in which the very diversity of doctrines concerning what is good, true, beautiful, and so on, is supposed to be celebrated. So as I finish, here are some substantive forms of betrayal. The betrayal of our inheritance of faith within the Church of England, concerning the parish, concerning marriage, concerning the authority of Scripture, including by some but not all bishops and many clergy. Paradidomi, handed over, betrayed, not paradidomi, handed down faithfully. The betrayal of freedom of thought by some in universities. The betrayal of national defence by governmental and military management failures to invest effectively in the armed forces over decades. The betrayal of the dying and of vulnerable children by many members of the political class and especially the medical profession, bound on oath to first do no harm. Indeed, some main institutions of England and Great Britain may seem just now somewhat unlikely mustering points for revival. Church of England, universities, many political parties, armed forces, the health service. For some, this even includes the monarchy. Unlikely places for the eyes of this nation to turn in search of wiser interrelation of our brains' hemispheres. But what response to betrayal? Jesus taught us this, I think. He saw Judas coming and yet called him friend. He prayed for those who abused him, and out of the depths of prayer came sacrifice and powerful resurrection to overturn the effects of betrayal. And so by that same power, old paths of life, the monarchy, many others that we've mentioned today, may be renewed, trod with many others, churches from east and west, north and south, who share faith in the living God. I also began by saying, and with this I do conclude, but if we do not confess our complicity in betrayal, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. This is a kind of right hemispheric sadness engaged in our personal past, and that is an aid to revival. A political tone which forgets our universal sinfulness in aid of some simple glory story of our national past will obstruct the very revival which we need. But the paths of revival will lie in finding forms of the first-person plural which incorporate not only our own betrayals and denials of Christ, following Judas and Peter, but also our patterns of loyalty to Christ, following the beloved disciple, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the other women who did accompany Christ to his death and who did share in the joy of resurrection life. Thank God that Peter, who denied Christ, is not forgotten, but addressed, spoken to. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. Take care of my lambs. Feed my sheep. Jesus' words and the words of Scripture revive the betweenness of the right hemisphere, the shared acoustic space created by psalm reading and singing, by sermons, by liturgy, by godly conversation, all good culturally created traditions of the church, including still, mercifully, the Church of England. Peter's restoration gives us hope for that restoration of covenantal life and the places and institutions by which our loyalties are ordered. As we anticipate Holy Week, we're all invited to be revived by the one who was given to weave us by faith into the life of the risen, ascended Son, the Holy Spirit of God.
Good morning. You don't have to get too close up here, it'll get hot. Oh, it will. Okay. Well, you start with Dr. Ian McGilchrist and you end this session with a Southern boy from Alabama. I guess you didn't expect that. That was wonderful. Those were excellent. I'm coming to you today as a practitioner, as a boots on the ground kind of person. I have used Dr. McGilchrist's work as a heuristic for my classics. In my classes at Stanford University. That's why I'm here today. I want to thank you to the Pusey House and the Danube Institute for allowing me an opportunity, a brief opportunity, to give you some reflections of Dr. Ian's work in my life. Work that has meant a great deal to me as a practitioner, not only in ministry, but in Christian higher education in the great state of Alabama. What stands beneath so much of our cultural disorder, of course, as we've mentioned, is a disorder of attention. We're not only thinking wrongly at times, we are seeing incorrectly. And when our ways of seeing becomes distorted, our loves become distorted as well. This is one of the reasons I have found Dr. McGilchrist's work so illuminating, both in my calling as a minister among Alabama Baptists and as a professor in Christian higher education. His work has provided for me not merely a critique of modern habits of mind, but a framework for recovering what it means to be human and how we are meant to attend to the world, attend to one another, and ultimately attend to God. One of the simplest ways I have come to put this in my classes and amongst churches is what you give attention to, you learn to love. What you love, you learn to defend. And what you defend, you eventually build institutions to protect. That movement from attention to love, to loyalty, to institution building seems to me enormously important, because institutions are never neutral. Schools, churches, government, media systems, even families, all of them are shaped by what they have learned to notice, what they reward, and what they treat as real. If our attention is trained towards efficiency, abstraction, utility, and control, then our institutions will begin to reflect those same values. But if our attention is trained towards presence, wonder, moral responsibility, and the irreducible dignity of persons, then we begin to build communities capable of sustained meaning. And that brings us, I think, to the theme of revival. Revival is not merely heightened religious energy, public excitement, or even cultural influence, important as those might seem. At a deeper level, revival is a renewal of attention. It is the recovery of the capacity to see again, to see God as God, the neighbor as neighbor, the world as charged with meaning, and the self not as sovereign, but as accountable and beloved. If our crisis, in part, a crisis of distorted attention, then revival may be understood as the restoration of faithful attention. In my own Baptist tradition back home, revival carries a particular weight. At its best, it has never meant excitement or religious atmosphere. It has meant repentance, renewed responsiveness to the Word of God, awakened preaching, deeper holiness, and a fresh dependence upon the work of the Holy Spirit. Revival in that sense is not simply about larger crowds or stronger emotions. It is about a people being brought again under the reality of God. It is about our hearts awakened, our conscience stirred, our sins confessed, Christ treasured, and the church renewed in faithfulness and in her witness. That's why I think Dr. McGilchrist's works matter so much in our conversations. His work has helped name the pressures that train us to see the world in partial and flattened ways. But it also helps us recover a richer version of the human person. We are not brains on a stick. We are not merely consumers, processors, bundles of preferences. We are creatures made for relationship, perception, reverence, and ultimately love. We do not simply analyze the world, we indwell it. We do not merely extract meaning, we receive it. We are not only spectators of reality, we are participators in it. That matters immensely in Christian higher education. In the great books tradition in which I teach at Samford University, one of the deepest aims is not just the transfer of information or even the sharpening of analysis, important as those are. The deeper aim for me is the formation of attention. It is to help students learn how to see, how to dwell with a text long enough for it to question them, how to inhabit moral and spiritual realities larger than themselves. Also, how to encounter truth not merely as a data to master, but as something that addresses them and calls them to repentance. And in that sense, education itself can participate in renewal. If revival involves learning to see again, then one task of Christian higher education is to resist the habits of speed, distraction, and flattening that keep students at the surface of things. We want to help them become the kind of people who can attend deeply, listen patiently, read charitably, and respond wisely. This is not only an academic concern, it is a profoundly human one. I've seen this matter not only in the classroom, but in evangelism as well. It is not enough simply to marshal arguments or master techniques. People must attend to as persons, not problems. They must be encountered in the dignity of their humanity, not merely answered at the level of objection. And that, I think, is one of the most helpful gifts in Ian's work. He gives us language for why presence, patience, and attention are not secondary to truth, but part of how truth is rightly received. In that way, also, apologetics itself can become part of a work of renewal. Not renewal in the sense of novelty, but renewal in the sense of recovering the humane and faithful ways of seeing. To engage another person well is already to refuse the reduction of the person as a category, a threat, or a talking point. It is to meet them as a neighbor. And where that kind of humane presence is restored, the conditions for genuine witness become much stronger. I've seen Dr. McGilchrist's thought help clarify why this matters countless of times. Students today are very skilled at scanning, sorting, and reacting, but much less practiced in sustained attention, patient contemplation, and receptive presence. They can move quickly across surfaces, but they struggle to dwell deeply. And yet the deepest human questions cannot be answered by speed. What does it mean to be human? What's worth loving? What kind of world do we want to live in? What do we owe one another? These are questions that require a certain kind of attention, a way of seeing shaped by humility, shaped by patience, and by the openness to reality as more than what can be managed. The same is true in the church. Pastoral ministry at its heart is also a formation of vision. The church teaches people what to notice. It teaches them what is worthy of reverence, what is worthy of repentance, and what is worthy of hope. In worship, in preaching, in prayer, in the ordinances, and in the life of the gathered people, Christians are being retrained in how to attend. They're being taught to see that the world is charged with meaning, that their neighbor is not an interruption, but a person, that suffering is not meaningless, and that ultimately God is not absent. So when we speak of revival, I think we should speak not only of changed outcomes, but a change of perception. Revival is, in part, the healing of attention. It is the recovery of a people who can see clearly enough to love rightly and love deeply enough to live faithfully. It is a renewal of vision that becomes a renewal of life. And across the church more broadly, we all face the same danger. The danger of hollowing out what is sacred by reducing it to mere technique, utility, or abstraction. Dr. McGilchrist's work helps name that danger, but it also helps us recover a better vision, one in which attention is not thin or mechanical, but reverent, engaged, and alive. This is one of the reasons I find this framework so fruitful. It gives language to something pastors like me and professors and teachers have often known, that the crisis of our age is not merely that people hold bad ideas, but that we have been habituated into thin ways of perceiving. And if perception is thin, then love is thinned, then loyalty is thinned, meaning is thinned, and eventually the institutions built by such people also become thin. Efficient, perhaps, functional, perhaps, but unable to nourish the soul. So for me, the enduring value of Ian's work is that it helps us see that the struggle for culture is at root a struggle over attention and therefore over love. What kind of people are we becoming by the way we attend? What kind of communities are we forming by the loves we cultivate? And what kind of institutions will emerge from those loves? As a minister and as a professor, I find that to be one of the most urgent questions before us. Because if attention is the doorway to love, and as love is the source of loyalty, then the task before church and higher education is not merely to produce more information, but to form persons capable of faithful attention, persons able to receive the world as a gift, to encounter others as neighbors, and to live within the reality with wisdom, humility, and wonder. And perhaps I could end with this. I have often been struck by those moments in the gospel when Jesus himself marvels at other people's faith. That tells us something not only about the beauty of Christ's incarnate humanity, but about the extraordinary dignity of the human response to God. Faith in those moments is more than an agreement or opinion. It is a whole person response to reality. It is truth received, self laid open, transcendence acknowledged, and trust awakened. It is, in a sense, an integrated act of faithful seeing. And perhaps that is why revival matters so deeply. Revival is not merely intensity or momentum. It is the restoration of persons and communities to that kind of faithful, undivided Godward attention. And as I think of that kind of revival, often begins in smaller places than we can imagine. I think of my own home church in Alabama, a church that for us is old. It's 100 years old, which of course feels quite new in places like this. Last Sunday after morning Bible study, we had been talking about the book of Job and wrestling with Satan's place in our story. Just before worship, a retired school teacher who helps lead the class hurried over me and she said, "Tell me about this McGilchrist fellow. I do not know him, but I want to pray for him and I want God to use him." There was something beautiful in that moment, a seriousness, a humility, and a readiness to see that ideas are not abstractions only, but a part of the church's deeper work of receiving truth together. And I think of a student of mine at Samford University after we had been reading Thomas Paine and working through some of the weariness of the Enlightenment. At one point, she finally said with some sort of holy frustration, "Enough, Dr. Burford, enough. I cannot live in this world anymore. Let's go out and sing." I have never quite forgotten that because in its own way, that too was a moment of recognition, a sense that analysis alone is never enough. That human beings are made not merely to dissect reality, but to inhabit it, to respond to it, to join truth with praise. These moments may seem small, but perhaps that is often how revival is shaped in classrooms, in Sunday school rooms, in simple acts of prayer, in the recovery of wonder, in the refusal to remain trapped in thin and loveless ways of seeing. Revival begins when people learn by grace how to attend again. And perhaps this today is the place where such revival can begin. I'm very Baptist. And as a good Baptist, I'm almost tempted to add, maybe this is where the last revival starts. If so, come, Lord Jesus, come.
Microphone working. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Okay. Well, thank you very much to all of you. So throughout, and particularly during Ian's talk, I was reminded of a scene from one of my favorite works of philosophy from the late 20th century, which is, of course, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a trilogy of 5 books, famously. And in the 5th book, the opening scene is, I think, relevant to this. The opening scene is a spaceship flying through space, full of sleeping people, because it's going a long way. And it's equipped with a safety computer, which is designed to tell the ship if it's ever been hit by an asteroid. And the spaceship is then hit by a big rock, but unfortunately the rock hits the part of the ship that takes out the computer that tells the ship's been hit by a rock. And so, but the absurdity in this, and Douglas Adams, of course, is a genius, the absurdity of it and the satire on it is that the system, because the computer system doesn't know it's been hit by a rock, the system thinks everything is normal, so all the robots keep going around the ship, falling out into space through the hole. Now, the point of this analogy, I think the relevance of this talk is that where you're talking about us living in a very left-brained culture, not a right-brained culture, we're living in a society where a rock has knocked out our ability to recognize that we've been hit by a rock. And I'm just wondering, how do you solve that?
It is a serious problem. Let me just give a little anecdote. I go to see a patient who's come in the night having had a right hemisphere stroke. And so the left side of their body is paralyzed. And I'm told, yes, this gentleman came in with a stroke. I say to him, how are you doing? And he says, I'm fine. And I say, oh, that's good. No problems then? No, I'm fine. Any problems moving, for example, your left arm? No, it's fine. No. Well, can you just show me? And he goes, there. And I said, well, I didn't see anything move, did you? No, we didn't see anything move. And if you bring his arm round in front of him and say, now move that, he said, that's not my arm. That's your arm, doctor. In other words, no knowledge of the deficit and complete unwillingness to take responsibility for the situation. It's always somebody else's fault. I guess we can see that around the place a lot. I wish I knew what the short answer to it is. I don't think there is a short answer. I think, people often say, what can we do? What can we do about this situation? And I can waffle about rejigging our educational system so it has more of the humanities in it, so not just STEM subjects, they're not useless, but they're purely technical, whereas we actually need to get back to a knowledge of humanities. The key is in the name. We need to teach children to respond to poetry, to drama, to music, to philosophy, to their history, and all these things. But in themselves, that's okay. But the really key thing is to turn your attention inwards. We can join Greenpeace, it's fine. But don't, that's what I'm saying. I mean, the thing is, I'm not decrying these large global organizations, but their track record is not impressive. And where you need to begin is in here. Because if we were to save the rainforest because they are a supply of timber for the future, or they're good for tourism, or some dreadful thing like this, then it wouldn't be worth saving them. The only reason for saving them is because they are intrinsically, purposelessly magnificent creations, great works of imagination that we couldn't on our own achieve. So I think the thing is to turn to what you have responsibility for. None of you has responsibility to save the world. Impossible. Nobody asked you that. But you do have responsibility for one thing you were given, which is your own life and how you use that. And my belief is, I have to be very quick, but I believe that values, more and more I come back to value. I think value is absolutely central. And values are things that pre-exist us. And our job here is to turn to respond and build those values.
Thank you. Can I just, we've actually got 8 minutes. We've got over 10 minutes we've been given by John.
Okay.
So the kind of follow-up to this is really, I mean, you've talked about the Greeks and the Romans and now us, that this pattern of decline as cultures become more left-brained and forget the more holistic picture, they end up collapsing under their own weight in a sense. And the real question is, and I guess it's almost a political question as well, is to what is this reversible? I mean, you've mentioned there that individually we can do something, we cannot save the world, but the truth is we are still a society. The question is, how do we restore some understanding beyond simply people in, for instance, this room thinking for them in this way, but at a political level, how do you change the attitude of the society? Please.
You're very, very, very kind. And I missed most of your talk. I thought it was wonderful, but I have to say I'm creatively deaf. So I'm not sure that I got all the jokes.
That works out for me.
Okay,
Okay, I would just say, just initially before I reply to that from what I get from your work, it's not just about you, it's about the relationships that you cherish around you. I mean, so in itself, it's relational. We don't want to go down I object to the word post-liberal because I've never been a liberal. So, and I don't move in that everything is relational in that way. And just to play, so I'm much more skeptical about values because that becomes very Enlightenment, and then suddenly you've got principles. And I like this idea of practice, of being faithful to practice, of orthodoxy, tradition, that these things are set you free. There was a really great moment in your talk when you were talking about the paradox of that subordination, and also in terms of loyalty. I think it's much more potent to talk about fidelity, and being true to. So to answer this question about the politics, what's absolutely amazing to me, just think about it, is there is a national disgust about grooming gangs. There's something in the culture that says this is wrong. What's astonishing is that in the ruling class, they're constantly trying to contextualize it. Oh, well, it doesn't really matter. The revulsion also that came up with, the whole story with the Epstein files, with Peter Mandelson, there is a widespread, so that opens up the space of repentance or even atonement. There needs to be now the tragedy we face is that the Church of England is singularly incapable of leading that national atonement, it seems to me. It can't move into that space. So that's where we are is quite a radical place at the moment. There is widespread disgust with the ethics, of the logical ethics we could call, of the liberation of the person from all constraint, obligation and relationship. But that's still the dominant ideology, which is mad. I mean, it's a form of insanity. So then the answer is chemicals, right? Legal drugs that sort that out, rather than, what those encounters you were talking about with people with grace. So, things are moving right now. This is a really a time of re-enchantment. And what you're going to see is a hatred of that enchantment coming, that this is populism. Remember a definition of populism. Anybody who criticizes capitalism, they're a populist, right? That's the rule. This fear of democracy, this fear. I mean, I'm really interested to know, Trump is a very paradoxical figure to me. He's part demon, right? He's got all that. But also there's some sense of mythos in him, of tuning into deeper things in America, in what it could be. But all they see is the wickedness and the loathing. So, in one word, atonement is required. But we haven't got a church that can lead it. No disrespect.
I think we've been confessing our need yesterday and today. But I think just to pick up the spaceship analogy, right? So we've got this the system which observes the asteroid coming in. Connects, it seems to me, with the language of vigilance, potentially, on your side of things, Ian, but the sense of staying awake and looking out for, as well as threats, possibly. But we've had two attacks on the French so far, I think, yesterday and today. I'm going to add a third, which I hope helps in relation to jury trial. So I think it was Fortescue who described the different conditions which supported the possibility of effective jury trials. That is, that the English all lived close enough to each other, that they knew each other well enough that you could select a jury who'd be able to judge whether or not this was the kind of person who had done this kind of crime, whereas the French, the poor benighted French, all lived so far apart from each other, they couldn't possibly have the conditions which would support jury trial. So my question back, I suppose, back to Ian and others, is what are the conditions which make the possibility of effervescence more likely? You talked about effervescence as key moments of eruption, where there's renewal and so on. There have to be structural conditions, societal, political, legal, the way we organise ourselves. What are the conditions for effervescence which could, as it were, right the asteroids wrong?
We have 2 minutes left for any final thoughts or response to that.
Yeah, I have to confess that we don't know why these civilizations do this extraordinary thing of being dormant and then suddenly erupt. They don't build up gradually, as you might imagine. They seem to come fully fledged out of the head of Zeus or whatever it is. So and then they decay. So I don't know how these things happen, but creativity is not about making things happen. It's about stepping out of the way and creating conditions for something to come about that you don't yet know what it is. And that's not just a passivity. It's a kind of active withdrawal and attentive state. And we have to have this conversation another time, but I'm afraid that both the bureaucratic nature of our society, its rule following and so on, and AI will not make this easy to happen. So there we are.
But when you say that the condition is memory, some
yes, and I said, you know,
idea of a different thing, of a different way that can be tapped into. That's
I agree, and that's where my talk started. You know, but if you haven't had the experience, you don't really know.
Yeah. So I would say memory is the foundation of effervescence.
Okay, well, I think that's all we've got time for. So just to let everyone know, there's now going to be a coffee break for the next 20 minutes upstairs, coffee and tea as well, which I'm grateful for. And then at 11:30, we're back for the sixth panel. Maybe John was about to say this, actually. No, okay. Well, the challenge of pluralism is the Christian foundation of the state, a basis for national renewal. Okay, you've been a great panel. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much. Cheers. Of course.
Ursel room just out this door or the west doors.
Thanks so much. Cheers.
And there's also the St. Cross Cafe below the quad. The St. Cross Cafe is also available for chic coffees.
everyone. Thank you for coming back for our 6th and final panel. I have been instructed to keep despotically to time in this. We are starting 10 minutes late. We will finish 10 minutes late, but that will be it. And I intend to rule with an absolute rod of iron, keeping our speakers to time and encouraging you all to ask incisive, concise questions at the end. This panel, as you will see on the programme, is on the challenge of pluralism, posing the question of whether the Christian foundations of the state, both here in Britain and further afield, can be the basis for national renewal. And I'm delighted to have a distinguished multinational panel here to consider that precise question. I will introduce them very briefly with a kind of sort of Spartan, ultra-low church introduction with no smells and bells whatsoever. That's the one time you will ever get that in this chapel. So in the order that they will speak, David Campanale is a former BBC journalist. If you don't know his name, you will know his work. He was very involved, for example, in exposing the terrible persecution of the Uyghurs in China. He was also for a while an active Liberal Democrat. We don't hold that against him. He was a parliamentary candidate who was rather brutally deselected for his evangelical beliefs a couple of years ago. Zsolt Nemet is an economist and has been a member of the Hungarian parliament since 1990. He was from 1998 to 2002, and then again from 2010 to 2014, Hungary's Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. Diederik Boomsma is a conservative Liberal MP, that way round, not a Liberal Conservative, a conservative Liberal MP in the Netherlands. He was previously a member of the New Social Covenant Party, and he's also been a journalist and a writer with an extremely wide-ranging area of interest and expertise. And then finally, we have Ibn Thranum, who is a former editor and radio host at the Danish Broadcasting Corporation. She has a master's degree in theology and writes a great deal about the intersection of Christianity, politics, and European society. So these are the expert hands in which we are placed for this, our final session, and I'm going to invite David to come and be our first speaker. David.
Thank you, John. Speaking to an empty House of Commons last year, Danny Kruger, then a Conservative, called for what he called a national restoration and a revival of the faith, saying it's a mission for the whole country. Puritans in the 17th century, he told the House of Commons, brought Britain back from the edge. Now, at Liberal Democrat Party conferences, the outgoing president of the party hands to the new one a copy of John Milton's Areopagitica from 1644. Milton was one of Kruger's Puritans, and let me quote words I suspect my Lib Dem party colleagues will not be familiar with. It was Milton's address to Parliament. When God is decreeing to begin some new and great period, he wrote, what does he then but reveal himself, as his manner is, first to his Englishmen? Now, we are among continental friends, and I'm a proud citizen of the Italian Republic, but it falls to us to be those men and women. And we are poised for what Milton may call a great new period. So how is it to be done? Tom Hollands argued that people in this age of postmodernity want a full-fat, supernatural Christianity, not an emptied, rationalist one. I agree. Pelagian self-sufficiency cannot meet the challenges ahead, but a re-enchanted political order can. In his essay talking about bicycles, Oxford Don C.S. Lewis wrote, there are these 4 ages about nearly everything. Let's give them names, he said. And he went on. They are the unenchanted age, the enchanted age, the disenchanted age, and the re-enchanted age. This moment now is the move from disenchantment to re-enchantment. Not everyone agrees. Daily Mail writer Peter Hitchens declared recently that Britain's gone. Others say London is gone, and that good people should get out while they can, or at least send their children abroad. And plenty in Europe say the same thing about their countries. They blame pluralism, specifically the idea or the suggestion that all cultures are somehow morally equal. A Christian, Hitchens thinks time is up. He clearly doesn't have much hope for national redemption, but I take a different view. We need to reach within the constitutional riches of what former Danube Institute head of research, the late Professor David Martin Jones, called an ancient miasma. It is from this, he wrote, that the common law tradition and the confessional Christian state emerged. Lying within our constitution, we already have the means of national renewal. It requires us to call forth the deep magic within, as C.S. Lewis might also put it, to rediscover the manner in which Milton tells us God reveals himself. Pluralism in this political sense was made possible by the Christian foundation of the state. Are we not all one in Christ Jesus, the Apostle Paul writes, there being no Jew nor Greek? And like a phoenix emerging from within the flames of failed secularism, it is to the Constitution itself that we have the means of renewal and also the guarantee of individual liberties, together with the pluralism of political discourse. So when did we last see this constitutional phoenix rise? It was when our nation stood alone as it was destroyed by fire. The last Liberal to play a part in national government in Britain until Sir Edward Davey and others in the coalition of 2010 was Sir Archibald Sinclair, wartime leader of the Liberal Party, the antecedents of the Liberal Democrats. He didn't call himself a Christian, but by the end of World War II, Sinclair's observation of the series of miraculous military deliverances at the Battle of Britain, Normandy, and the Casablanca landings changed his outlook. He wrote of Great Britain thus: God has delivered and brought us to a present position for some great purpose, and now we must seek humbly to discover what that purpose is and then to be faithful to it. If only some of my Lib Dem colleagues would say something similar. Now, you'll be familiar with Churchill's portrayal of the war in 1940. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization, he said. But forged out of deliverance from that global catastrophe came Sinclair's conviction of national vocation. By fire, liberals discovered national purpose and God. Sinclair did not say in 1945, terrific, our victory shows Christian values trump fascist ones. Christian values. A phrase I avoid as it always begs the question, what kind of Christianity and which values? What Sinclair, Churchill and others saw rising from the flames of burning Britain was a martial nation, a praying nation, a united kingdom armed with God's strength to overcome a darkness that could have overwhelmed Western Christian civilization. For we are already enchanted, and pre-configured within our constitution lie assumptions of calling, vocation, and covenant. Don't doubt the mood of that moment just a few generations ago, or how the covenant with God was invoked. Speaking on D-Day and the embarkation of Allied armies on the beaches of Nazi-occupied France, King George VI, father to our late Queen, broadcast to the empire identical words of providence. In his brief address, he called the challenges of invasion a new summons of destiny. Our king's grandfather said he desired to, and I quote, solemnly call my people to prayer and dedication. We're not unmindful of our own shortcomings, past and present, he declared. We shall ask not that God may do our will, but that we may be enabled to do the will of God. And we dare to believe that God has used our nation and empire as an instrument for fulfilling his high purpose. That phrase again, purpose, It speaks of calling and prayer, the invocation of the terms of Britain's ancient covenant with God. George VI would not have suffered contemporary counsels of despair. Against deeper civilizational challenges than our own, that greater generation did not speak of surrender. Unlike our leaders so far, our forebears knew they needed to get on their knees. To quote the king again, "At this historic moment," he urged, "surely not one of us is too busy, too young, or too old to play a part in a nationwide, perchance a worldwide vigil of prayer." Now, I'm a politician as much as a journalist, and politics must be practical. I continually think in terms of advocacy of the Labour interest in this project through campaigning, industrial action as a trade unionist where required. I'm the last person to lead the National Union of Journalists in taking BBC News off air. I know some of you here will be grateful for that. But it's a civilizational that has come to fore issue that's come to fore at this moment. Would Sinclair, Churchill and the King say to us at this moment, we too must prepare our advance and gather our strength under God for this current moment. Encouraging signs of Christian revival help us focus on where our heritage comes from. But a note of warning is required. The nature of the foundation is covenantal. It's not power-based or rooted in the imposition of morality, as if that is enough to change hearts. We should understand that we must arm ourselves first with where the magic lies. Luke Bretherton has a sense of it, he was here yesterday. A section of his St. Andrew's Encyclopedia of Theology describes what he titles the scriptural antecedents of democracy, and he alludes to the source of the power. And I quote, "The obligation to obey God's law is founded on the prior agreement of the people, generated through a covenant. Covenants thereby bring into being a moral and political community of mutual obligation, but one that is contingent upon keeping the covenant." This whole concept, this paradigm, is what Sinclair and the King spoke of in terms of relationship. A people before their God. Not ideology, not values. They kept to the terms of the covenant and did this through acts of confession, national repentance, and humiliation. And God is therefore a party to the terms of the covenant. He is the one who ensures the dynamism of the relationship, as it is he who brings forth miracles of national deliverance. And it is within our constitution that the magic lies. For this moment, politicians must become conjurers. We must magic up the terms of this covenant. And their insights, our forebears, were born out of national trauma and testing, and we can learn from them or go through traumas and trials of our own. Shuffling the deck chairs of our civilizational Titanic by switching one lot of politicians for another, New Labour, Farage's reform will not do it, or the ECR and Patriots group in the European Parliament in place of van der Leyen's coalition. These swappings of the deck chairs on the Titanic are not enough. The gospel denies the modern idea implicit in the secularist project that God is upstairs where his rules govern, but that somehow downstairs on earth, it's for humanity to do what it thinks best. These secularist assumptions are wrong-headed. God is sovereign over both spheres. As I conclude, King Charles in his coronation was called upon by the Archbishop of Canterbury to remember that the whole world is subject to the power and empire of Christ our Redeemer. Actively, the political class of this generation must do the same. So I end with John Milton one more time. England, he said, was the mansion house of liberty in Areopagitica. England was the champion of civil liberty, he continued. We have the honor to precede other nations who are now laboring to be our followers. How far Britain has fallen. It's a practical political project for us all to now draw on this ancient paradigm of covenant by means of national repentance and invocation of its terms. Britain will rise phoenix-like, to meet this high calling and national purpose, and through us in modest ways, God's justice may be brought to the world, that we may discover again in Christ where true liberty lies. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zsolt Német. As a way of introduction, I would like to inform you that I've been introduced, but probably it is important to mention to you that in the Council of Europe, I'm the president of the Conservative and Patriotic Group as well, which integrates many European patriotic conservative parties, including the Tories. And also, I would like to greet all of you in the name of the big Hungarian delegation today. We are many, and express my gratitude to the Pusey House for allowing to build this bridge between Hungary, Britain, and America, and also among laymen, theologians, and priests. Thank you very much, and also to express my gratitude to the Danube Institute. I wonder if you are aware that the Danube Institute is not just reflecting a symbol from Budapest, the chain bridge, but this is exactly the same as you can find in Marlow. The chain bridge is a replica in Budapest of the chain bridge in Marlow, which was built in 1832. And the Budapest one was built in 1849. So you are very close to the Danube. It is not the same whether Christianity permeates the life and identity of a nation, or whether those exercising public authority within a nation merely invoke the Christian faith and Christian values. The latter is not necessarily objectionable in itself, although in unfavorable circumstances it may indeed become so. The true objective, however, must be the former: Christianity that permeates national identity and the transformation of the nation into both a framework and a field for evangelization. A Christian political elite fulfills its proper role only insofar as it serves and advances this goal. And that's what we are trying to do in Hungary for about 15 years. But there is an important positive tendency, not just in Hungary, but we can see all over Europe. We could just hear what was said by David Campanelli. But I think we must pay attention to some serious challenges in this process, and I would like to talk about the challenges. The past year, above all, the transfer of power to President Trump and the unfolding of his second administration has brought a significant turning point in matters related to Christianity. The world's greatest secular power has officially begun to act against the ideological current that calls itself liberal democratic, and in particular against its anti-Christian and quasi-atheistic activities. This development has both domestic and international dimensions. In the United States, for instance, Christian groups whose religious freedom had been violated have begun to win court cases. And in one state, legislation is being prepared that would allow the disruption of church services to be sanctioned. At the same time, the protection of Christian culture has become part of the narrative used to justify action against illegal migrants. Yet the action itself, less its existence than the means by which it is carried out, has been sharply criticized from a Christian perspective, especially by the hierarchy of the Catholic Church and also by certain Protestant circles. Internationally, the United States has launched a military operation against terrorism in Nigeria under the banner of protecting Christianity. Moreover, American government rhetoric concerning Europe increasingly includes criticism that Europe is abandoning its Christian roots, cultural roots, except the healthier Central European part. It should not be forgotten that among the great powers, it is not Trump's America that first adopted a Christian narrative. Much earlier, President Putin had already sought to establish a strong domestic Christian, more precisely Russian Orthodox legitimacy for himself. Over time, he also began to justify his attack against Ukraine using this narrative, on the one hand by claiming to defend those parts of Ukrainian Orthodoxy that remained under Russian jurisdiction, and on the other hand by presenting the conflict as a struggle in the name of Christian civilization against what he describes as the liberal paganism of the West. Europe has therefore found itself caught in the crossfire of two, though fundamentally different, but still Christian narratives. The Russians have even attempted to create an alliance between the two narratives, for example, in connection with the death of Charlie Kirk, though with little success. Nevertheless, it is true that the world of confessing Christians, that is, Christians not merely in a political sense, but also in a religious one, is increasingly shaped not only by a liberal democratic form of Christianity, but also by the Christian narratives of the great powers. From the perspective of Britain and continental Europe, this currently means that within Europe and the United Kingdom, the primary challenge is liberalism, while beyond them, the challenge is the narrative of so-called political Christianity. And this latter challenge also carries significant dangers. One need only think of what the Russians are doing in Ukraine in its name. The third front confronting Europe is political Islam, which appears partly through southern migration and partly through terrorism, itself often connected to migration. From a European perspective, Islam, migration, and terrorism form a kind of triangle. It is a grave mistake to identify any of these entirely with either of the other two, yet it is equally a grave mistake not to recognize or to deny the connections that exist between them. At the same time, the Islamic challenge facing Europe, the UK, and to some extent the US, where in certain states legislation against the application of Sharia is already being prepared, represents only a secondary front of the broader rise of political Islam, which long predates the strengthening of political Christianity. The Islamic Republic of Iran, which is now hopefully approaching its final days, was established in 1979, and Saudi Arabia likewise shifted towards a form of political Islam, albeit a Sunni one, alongside a broader religious revival. There are also democratic variants of this development. The most prominent example is the clearly democratic political Islam of Indonesia, and despite its democratic shortcomings, Erdogan's politics in Turkey can still broadly be included here. The countries mentioned may be described as small great powers, and thus it can be said that the great power politics of Christianity had an Islamic precedent. Today, this phenomenon is partly a rival of political Christianity, for example, in matters related to migration, yet partly also its ally against liberal atheism. Characteristically, in the British political sphere, the most visible opposition to euthanasia recently came from the Muslim Labour politician. In addition, there is the world's most populous country, India, where political Hinduism associated with Modi has long exercised stable dominance. At the level of global politics, it is more often an ally of political Christianity, particularly in opposition to liberal democracy. Yet, at the level of Indian states, and especially in certain smaller regions, it is frequently the adherents of this movement who persecute Christians quite harshly. And there is also China, formerly a communist, that is atheist state, which is increasingly attempting through the Sinicization of religions to fuse them into a specifically Chinese syncretic faith that could eventually replace Marxism as the state ideology. Where then is the liberal democratic world? In Europe and UK, it remains quite alive. Within the bureaucratic structures of international organizations, it is still attempts to exercise authority over the world. In reality, however, it governs mainly the organizations themselves, rather than the world, for the major powers have already distanced themselves from it and in many cases turned against it. The shift in the global balance of power was symbolized, in a sense, by President Trump's inauguration. All this is important to recognize because it means that Christians living in the Western world increasingly face two different, distinct types of challenges, and only one of them is the narrative of liberalism, which sometimes even disguises itself as being rooted in Christian values. The other challenge is to simplify political Christianity, which in many respects appears to be a more comfortable partner than liberalism because it appeals to the same values as confessing Christianity. Yet there is a danger, indeed more than a danger, as the example of Putin's Russia already shows, that political Christianity may abuse these values and thereby begin to erode them. Then when another political shift might occur, whether in a liberal or a radical left-wing direction, in Britain God knows into which direction this country will go, the sins of political Christianity will be laid at the feet of confessing Christians. For this reason, the intellectual workshops of confessing Christianity are of great importance. Ethical forums, institutes dealing with political questions, and not least theological centers, dialogue between different Christian denominations is equally important, while naturally distinguishing between religious organizations that are under the influence of great powers and those that are not. One must recognize, for instance, that any dialogue conducted today with the Russian Orthodox Church risks entering into partnership not with confessing Christianity, but with a kind of political Christianity. Along similar principles, attempts at inter-religious dialogue are also essential, would be essential. Then, I think if we are able to identify possibilities and challenges at the same time, then Christian revival might become our post-liberal hope or even reality. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And ladies and gentlemen, what a great honor to be here in Oxford with you amongst such a distinguished set of great scholars and writers and thinkers. I'm a mere ecologist and a politician. So thank you, Jonathan and John, for dragging me away from the budget hearings in the Dutch Parliament. The Dutch Parliament is temporarily housed in this brutalist monstrosity from the 70s. So this is a vast improvement also in that sense. Now, I've served on the Amsterdam City Council for 7 years and on the National Parliament of the Netherlands for 2 years. I've just been re-elected in November, having a switched party, which is something we do in the Netherlands. Well, I think Churchill did it as well, but it's becoming more and more frequent. Listening this morning to the sessions on the technocracies, the hollow center of technocracy, that really sounded to me deeply and disconcertingly accurate. And I would just like to give a few examples from my own experience in these past few years, what this actually means. So why do people go into politics? Now, Charles de Gaulle, he famously said he was driven by defending what he called a certain idea of France, which to him included an idea of French greatness as well. France cannot be France without French greatness. And that meant, of course, not being bullied by the Americans or being annoyed by the British too much. But most people now, they will say, they go into politics, as expressed in their maiden speeches in Parliament. They'll say, we go because we want to fight climate change or racism or inequality, or sort of very abstract things, abstract ideals, or to solve technical problems. But at the same time, a lot of political rhetoric is more about repeatedly expressing the correct opinions about these problems or about these issues to show oneself to be pure and benign. It's about virtue signaling rather than the practice of prudence as a political virtue. And I think the decline of Christian faith over the past decades has gone accompanied by a decline in the art of politics. And I also think that the two are related, and that to revive the one, we may also need to revive the other. And there seems a bit of a paradox in politics right now. There's this obsession of control, and at the same time, so much of politics has become weirdly powerless. So we are faced with these immense problems: housing shortages, crime, plummeting educational standards. We're talking about crisis from crisis, migration, but all of our politics seems to exude this kind of helplessness. Like the politicians are saying, hey, we're really bothered by this as well, but what can we do, you know? At least in my country, but the occasional snippets of news that reach us from these aisles, one cannot avoid the impression that things aren't that different over here. And whenever I see footage of Keir Starmer coming by, he looks completely bewildered. And just this morning I read an article, I don't even know it's true, but it said that the British have decided that their banknotes, that Churchill and other people are going to be replaced by beavers and badgers. I mean, that can't be, I mean, is this true? So we keep getting these snippets of news, and I just can't believe that they're true. But of course, if problems were easy to solve, someone would have done it already. And it's also true that, as Thomas Sowell said, there are no solutions in politics, only trade-offs. And that's true. But that's not the only thing that's going on. The problem is that the very room or space for political decision-making, for statecraft as an exercise of prudence to make those trade-offs aimed at the common good, that space has been shrunk, has shriveled. Why? Because the freedom to make political decisions has been colonized in a way by law and regulations. So power has increasingly shifted and moved away from politicians towards civil servants and judges. And that reminds me very much of what Professor McGilchrist said about the master and his emissary this morning. It's astonishing. The most crucial questions about the future of my country, decisions are not being made by elected politicians in parliament, but in courtrooms, and particularly the courtrooms in France, in Strasbourg, which also continues to hold sway over here, even though you got out of the European Union. So it's a great paradox. The government continues to grow and expand into ever more spheres of life, but the actual sphere of politics continues to shrink. This is very strange. So in this proceduralist technocracy, politics seems to become reduced to some kind of delivery agency. It's just there to implement decisions taken elsewhere, and this leads to a lot of this empty posturing. So parties pretend the thing is about, they pretend that they're about trying to solve technical problems and coming to agree on how to do that, but politics is really also about deciding what the problems actually are. And now I want to talk to you about wolves. The wolf. This is a magnificent, beautiful creature. And in England, it was chased away, I think, in the 17th century. In my country, the last wolf was hunted in the middle of the 19th century. But since a few years ago, it's come back. For decades, they were stuck behind the Iron Curtain. But once the Iron Curtain was taken down, and I think they started making their way back across Germany. So I think we partly have Ronald Reagan to blame for this when he said, tear down this wall. And the wall's been torn down, and now the wolf is coming back. And now we have about 150 wolves roaming the Netherlands. And as an ecologist, I am an ecologist by training, I worked in nature conservation, I think this is beautiful, this is wonderful. Finally, we have a top predator back in our country. And how many thousands of nights did our ancestors not shiver around the fire at night, listening to the howling of wolves in the darkness? So it's romantic. But for sheep farmers, it's not so great. So they've already killed, these 150, they've killed 6,000 sheep. And they are completely defenseless. I mean, goats will form a small circle and try to defend their young. Sheep are entirely defenseless. And wolves in the wild, because game is so scarce, they will when they find prey, they can eat immense amounts of food, so they will kill a lot. So this means that when they find sheep, they will kill all the sheep and just eat what they can. Now, wolves are the most widely distributed mammal in the world. They live in the Arctic tundras, but also in the hot deserts. And because they're very clever and they can adapt. And that means they can also adapt to landscapes dominated by humans, like the Netherlands. But now, in the east of the Netherlands, schools have started closing down playgrounds because there's wolves. Now, wolves have started eating pets. They've eaten several dogs. They've been chasing cyclists, and they've even been biting children. So it turns out that some of these old fairy tales about wolves, the big bad wolves, they actually held some truth. Now, some people might want to ban the wolves from being in the country altogether, and others will say, well, we have to find ways to live with the wolf. And that seems to me a proper topic for political debate. But the one thing you actually obviously have to do is to prevent wolves from growing more and more accustomed to humans so that they will lose their shyness. And this is what's going on now. The wolves come closer and closer, and they're losing their shyness, and this means that the risk of a fatal incident will continue to grow. But to stop them from losing their shyness, you need to chase them away. And the problem is, that would be illegal. The courts don't allow this because in 1979, the Netherlands signed the Treaty of Bern on biodiversity. And that was implemented into European law, into Habitat Directive. And that states that wolves receive the highest protection, highest status of protection. And that means we're not only not allowed to shoot them, of course, but you're also not allowed to even disturb them. Even if they set up camp in a small park next to a children's playground. Now, in 1979, the Treaty of Bern was signed, and all the countries, such as Poland and Turkey, where there were already wolves present at that time, they reserved an opt-out for the wolf, for that protective status, because they realized, yeah, we want to save them, but we also understand sometimes you need to chase them away. But in 1979, there were no wolves in the Netherlands. And so because of a treaty signed half a century ago, now the law doesn't allow us even to chase them away, and politics is entirely powerless to change it. Even though millions and millions have already been spent developing policies on wolves, and there are more civil servants writing these policies than there are actually wolves in the Netherlands. And still nothing is done. And so we're just waiting for some accidents to happen. Now, this is just an example of how the way the rule of law now works seems to thwart democratic decision-making and also thwart common sense. Because of treaties, international treaties signed decades ago under vastly different circumstances, in a very different world, we can now not take the steps that everyone would agree to be common sense. Now, I don't want to say this seems symbolic, but it does sound familiar, for the same, of course, is going on with regards to migration. So for decades, there's been an overwhelming majority of citizens that oppose mass migration, and elected politicians they've been electing politicians promising to deliver, but mass migration has gone on nevertheless. And it's been presented like a natural phenomenon, like the arrival of birds in the spring. So the idea is we can control the climate, but we cannot control our own borders. It's a very strange presumption. But also because migration is almost entirely governed by international treaties, and more importantly, decisions taken by judges enforcing those treaties in a way that has never been, that politicians were never able to foresee, we are now stuck with a system that is utterly corrupt. We say to the whole world, if you're in trouble anywhere, come here and we will grant you asylum, but only if you travel here illegally first, because you will not be given a visa to join a plane. But if you give all your money to a human trafficker and survive the dangerous journey across the desert and the sea, and then you arrive in the EU and you say the magic word asylum, then you have the prospect of staying in the most generous welfare states in the world. But this means thousands die in the attempt, the poorest people stay behind, and our countries cannot cope anymore. The system is perverse, but the legal order prevents us from asking the right moral questions. Yes, we have a duty to help those in need, but there's a vast difference between helping those in need temporarily and giving people the right to permanently settle in your country. But because we're stuck in this system, the politics is reduced to window dressing. And of course, this technocracy produces a response in the form of populism, and this populism in turn produces more technocracy, as the powers that be want to discourage the politicians from interfering in this system, and that produces then more populism. So this is the vicious loop we're now stuck in. And sometimes you forget about how absurd the situation is, that the presumably most democratic countries in the world, England, which gave birth to the whole idea of freedom in a way, that now the freedom of peoples to make their own decisions that most fundamentally affect their country and politics is mostly powerless. So what is keeping us from stepping out of this loop? And I think because technocracy, or this proceduralism, is the result of a deeper misconception, which is the illusion of neutrality. And it's been discussed here before, but our politics now seems guided by this deeply held, but often unconsciously held presumption that the state should be neutral. And diversity is, of course, another word for the same thing. But the Netherlands, or even Britain for that matter, is not a neutral piece of real estate with hordes of individuals waving around individual rights. It's a historically grown cultural community. It is a particular place. And the progressive dream of a world without borders and without history impedes or impairs a true understanding of that. And it is a refusal in a way to be incarnate, perhaps. And this idea of artificial neutrality has replaced the idea of home, and politics should really serve that home. And that is one of the things I learned from Roger Scruton. So I think we need to recover a real politics of home. And to do that, the only way to do that is to assume our inheritance, because we are land, as in the phrase of Pierre Manant said, marked by Christianity. Nature abhors a vacuum, and supernature abhors a supervacuum. This neutrality cannot really exist, but the illusion allows our thinking to be colonized by all sorts of false political religions, from climate to Islam. In the words attributed to Hilaire Belloc, this is what forgetting Christianity does to a civilization. The modern world imagines that it has outgrown religion. It has done nothing of the kind. It has merely forgotten it. And because it has forgotten it, it no longer understands itself. Men do not realize that the whole framework of their moral judgments, their political habits, and even their intellectual methods were formed within a Christian society and cannot long exist outside it. But when that framework breaks, they will not find themselves enlightened, but bewildered, not free, but enslaved, not rational, but confused. Now, the late, I'm finishing up now, sorry. The late Benedetto Croce, he argued that all the achievements of Christianity had already been absorbed into the welfare state in a better form. In the social democratic welfare state. So we no longer need those roots. And I think that has been disproven now. We need to recover a politics of home, as marked by Christianity, and we need to fear the wolf. Thank you.
Yeah, I also would like to say thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak. As a theologian, I'm very honored to be able to speak in this chapel. For quite a number of years, I have been writing about that I don't think we really have a political crisis in the West, even though everything today is about politics, but that we have a spiritual crisis. And people are really looking for salvation in politics, but they only find security politics, crisis management, and economic growth. And that's not really anything you can base your life on. But I think when we talk about the Christian revival, I think there are two groups. Number one, they're quite loud. These are the people that are out in the streets. They have rediscovered Christianity in the defense of Western civilization. They are the people waving the flag, showing up at Unite the Kingdom. And that is Christianity treated primarily as civilizational identity marking, rather than a demanding moral doctrine. It's less about belief, more about heritage, borders, and cohesion. And it doesn't require faith, only loyalty. You could say that these people are kind of political activists. Then there are group two. They're more silent. Those are the ones searching for the truth, transcendence, clarity, and substance. It's primarily Generation C, and their parents have not been able to provide them any answers to the big questions of life. So they're looking for metaphysics, transcendence. And I talked to quite a number of them because I'm a convert to Catholicism myself many years ago, so I feel like their story also reflects my story. And what they tell me is that they feel this inner emptiness, and they're looking for a higher moral authority because they're tired of trying to find all the answers themselves. And they also have realized that voting harder doesn't really help because everybody thinks with the next election, with the next new political leader, everything is going to change. But no matter how hard you vote, people have realized, and I also think in this country, that nothing is really going to change. But I want to add that it's not only in the Christian civilization that this is happening, it's actually also happening among Muslims. An unprecedented number of Muslims in the Muslim world, in the Middle East, is actually converting to Christianity. And the ironic part is when they come to the Western world, they become more radicalized in the Islamic faith. But in their own countries, where it's very dangerous to become a Christian, we see so many Muslims converting to Christianity. And I want to come back to that because I think it's time for us now to ask whether the Muslims could be part of the Christian revival and what that would do to our civilization. So I'm going to come back to that. But I want to say a little bit more about these two groups because the first group, which are the political activists, they are very concerned about saving the civilization. And this is, a phrase you would hear in many conferences today, we have to save the civilization. But the other group who are looking for the truth, they are more concerned about saving their souls. And I think that is crucial because it was the time when the Western civilization stopped to be more concerned about their souls and more concerned about the civilization that everything went wrong. And I think we really have to be very mindful of that. Since the French Revolution, we have sort of had the state as the sovereign entity in our civilization, not God. But I think actually now what's happening with the Christian revival cannot be explained just by social trends or because people are tired of the political situation or their parents could not provide any answers. I actually do think that God is acting, that God has taken pity on our generation and our apostasy. So he's trying to reach out now. And it's a very important moment because I think it really matters how we respond to that. And try to reflect on what does God want us to do in this particular moment in history. And that brings me to my next point. What is Christian culture? Christian culture, I would say, is a byproduct. It's not a goal in itself. It was created by people who put God first and who wanted to go to heaven. And to go to heaven, you had to lead a holy life, a sacred life. You need to, all the old kings like Charlemagne, he understood that he only had power because he had to, build a sacred order for people to reach salvation and go to heaven. And he was very aware, I'm very occupied with Charlemagne for the time being, that he was under the judgment of God, that he was not the highest authority, whereas the state today looks at itself like it is God. And, honestly, I don't think that the state right now is doing a very good job pretending to be God. But Charlemagne was very, very aware that he would be judged by himself, how he had exercised his power. And he needed to, establish this sacred order. So it was also made by people who worked for the greater glory of God. And you only have to look at this hall and this cathedral to understand what I mean. And Rod talked about it yesterday when he entered the Cathedral of Chartres. And I think that it's very important right now to be reminded that Europe is built not only on human achievement, but on God's grace. And that is the heart of Christianity, God's grace. And St. Thomas Aquinas says in the Summa that grace does not remove nature, but brings it to perfection. That God would never destroy our nature, but perfects it. It means we, of course, have our natural faculties like reason, will, moral action, and even the skills to make art. But it all comes in a cooperation with God's grace. And I think this is what we have forgotten. It doesn't mean that societies are perfect, because we will still have human sin and error, but still, grace can work through natural human culture. And you even have that in the Oxford University motto, Dominus illuminatum mea, God is my light. It means that divine guidance and spiritual light, you have to rely on that to get a deeper knowledge of the world, and it all derives from God. And I think it is extremely important that Christianity permeates every level and fabric of society and influence lawmaking, culture, art, schools. But we have to resist the temptation right now to immediately turn this Christian revival into a new political program, because that is actually secular thinking. And what I think we have to sort of learn now how to go from secular thinking to what I would say is sacred thinking. And that is actually to put the soul first and not the civilization and not politics. And that's, very, very hard for us, because we're so trained now to think in secular terms that everything has to be translated into politics. And that's a big temptation right now. So I think that we need politicians and also people in general, lay people, who are willing to let God's grace work through them, which has always been the principle in Christianity. Democracy is in a deep crisis because it has lost its telos. It means a higher purpose, which can only come from a transcendent power like God. I think many politicians today feel that we only have, like, as I said before, security politics has sort of replaced salvation, and crisis management and economic growth, which is materialistic. So I think we need Christian leaders. People want leaders. You see now people voted for Trump because they wanted a strong leader, and I think many people today are disillusioned because he was seen as, the savior of the Western civilization in many ways, and he did not keep his promises. I won't go into that, but I think many people know now you cannot put your hope in a human person. You need a transcendent power to survive in this world and to combat evil. We're also in a big spiritual warfare between good and evil, and only to rely on politics is too fragile. You need something higher than that. So, but since we are so trained to think in secular terms, I think for many people it takes a lot of courage to stand up and talk about their faith, first of all. And I really, really would like to hear more from politicians, or see politicians that are not concerned about the next election, but would simply stand up for truth and moral order and a sacred order. And I think actually they would get a lot of votes, because people are longing so much for authenticity and for somebody who just dares to speak the truth, not thinking about what would my voters think about me. I think we really need politicians that have that courage to be witnesses for their faith. Because I think I see in my circles, whenever somebody articulate their faith, people suddenly say, oh yes, you're so right, but they don't have the terminology. Many people today come from families where they have never talked about God, so they don't know the words and the concepts. So that's why it's very, very important that everybody, like Mary Harrison said yesterday, don't be embarrassed, just talk about it. Also when you are at work or when you have a dinner, it's not only politicians. But I would like to come back here in my last part of my talk to the conversion of Muslims. I think it's very, very interesting if Islam could be a part of this revival, because we see Muslims as our enemies. But I see a lot of people that actually do want to believe in God, but for me, as a Christian, I see that they are misled about who's God. And I just written an article for the next issue of the European Conservative about this. And I raised the question, what would Europe have looked like today if we had sent pastors and priests to asylum centers just 20, 30 years ago? Not to have forced conversions, of course, but just to have a conversation about who is God. Right now, I'm in contact with a new network of young Muslims that have converted to Catholicism in London. And they told me that they don't see Christianity as the city on the hill in the Western world. But they said to me, if more Muslims could see Christianity as vibrant and really serious about their faith, many more Muslims would convert to Christianity. Because one of them told me that his family has been here for several generations, and they were quite respectful of the Christian culture before everything just began really to decline. But now when they see this decline and Christianity, something with naked women, people going out drinking, you know, not taking their faith seriously, they would rather become Muslim. So that's a big challenge for us. And it's actually liberalism and godlessness that drives them into radical Islam. It's not so much about the strength of Islam, it's about the weakness of the Christians. I've said that for many years. And I do believe if they saw a better example, many of them would be open to become Christians. Because if you have an encounter with the love of Christ, why would you want to be a Muslim? And that's what they all tell. And what is interesting also that many of them have these visions and those dreams where Christ is appearing to them and he speaks to them. And they never ever doubt that he's the Son of God when that happens. So I see that God is working because these are in areas where it's very hard for Christian missionaries to enter those areas. So I think it's maybe sometimes I've been thinking about whether Islam even might be a kind of chastisement for the West. Because Martin Luther actually said that at a certain point where the Ottomans were close to Vienna, that he thought that they have reached that point because Christians were not very good Christians. But I think it's actually a wake-up call for us to rediscover our faith, and also for us to reach out to Muslims. And you might say, okay, yeah, that's just a dream. I just want to, end with reading aloud a passage from my article in the European Conservative, which is going to be published in a few weeks. But I'm sure it's okay that I read it aloud here. Because we have actually an experience from Denmark, how refugees actually wanted to go into the church when they arrived. So I'm going to read aloud here. That churches can reach Muslims and that Muslims are not inherently hostile to them is clear from a Danish experience. During the 2015 Syrian refugee wave, the church's integration service found that 70% of migrants turning to church-based meetings were Muslims. Secular authorities frequently could not or would not address their deep religious longings, leaving people alienated by cold bureaucracy. For most Muslims, faith matters far more than the democratic freedoms they are expected to embrace immediately. When local officers dismiss or reject talk of God, many naturally turn to churches for help, shared meals, legal guidance, language classes, contact families. Yet many churches, shaped by the same secular atmosphere, hesitate to move beyond practical aid and speak openly about God and the gospel. What if evangelization had been a natural part of that welcome? Might many have chosen Christ over Muhammad, sparing themselves and Western societies much heartache. Research consistently shows that Christian migrants and those who come to the faith in Christ face fewer integration challenges. So I would end on that note, and I think it's, when I think about all these young Muslims, when I see them in the streets of London and in Denmark, what if they all became Christians? Because they're already believers. I think then the revival could be really great, and I think there is a lot of potential in that, and I would say that politicians should, at least allocate money to those projects in churches where they could invite Muslims to at least talk about who is God. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers for their fascinating talks. This is the political session, so I'm going to be radically democratic and suggest that we dive straight into Q&A from you, the audience. There are a couple of microphones that will come round, so if you would like to start us off with the first question, I can see a hand here. A microphone is about to appear.
Thank you. Yes, one of the terms that seems to have been spoken of a bit like a phantom over the last 2 days is Christian nationalism. And my question to the panel would be, in light of the Great Commission, the call to disciple the nations, or Christianize them, and in light of the globalist secular context we've been discussing, and in light of the adjective Christian actually meaning Christian, why would you have a problem with Christian nationalism if you do, if that makes sense? You might want to define Christian nationalism as you understand it.
Who would like to dive in on that particular question? Diederik, you look like you're about to...
It's a very good question. I mean, nationalism, the term, at least in Dutch, has a negative connotation. People will say patriotism rather than nationalism, because nationalism will remind them of what I think someone said, like, my country, my mother drunk or sober. How did Chesterton say? Well, but the thing is, I think a true politics of home is always also about our national home, and that the nation state is a great product of Christian civilization, because basically you can form an identity in several ways. You can form a tribal identity, which you all have the fiction of a common ancestor. Well, that's a very closed system, because you cannot really join another tribe in that way. Or you can have a purely religious identity, which is formed on sharing the same faith. But what the achievement of the nation state in the West is, as Roger Scruton has explained in The West and the Rest, is this idea of the nation state as a common home, which is very open and people can join that. And I think, so in that sense, that is the sense that we need to recover, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit dangerous because Christianity... Oh, sorry.
It's not you, hold on.
Oh.
We get Evan's microphone. It's on.
Okay. Christianity is universal. And we have to keep in mind that
what actually created Europe was Christianity that was binding together different nation states. And then, of course, at that time was the Pope as the sign of unity between everybody. Being a Catholic, and I come from a very Protestant background, Denmark is a very Protestant, very anti-Catholic country, I see the difference. Because if the government breaks down, or if it is the nation state where sort of Christianity is incorporated into that, the government can sort of neglect the covenant, or they can, go into some kind of apostasy. But if you have something higher where the Pope does not submit to any secular power and is a sign of unity, you still have a moral structure, you still have spiritual authority over the state. And this is, of course, a problem, throughout history between state and church. But I think right now we see so many, for instance, in Denmark, and that was one of the reasons why I also decided to convert. The Danish Protestant church is a state church, and it's totally absorbed into the welfare state. It has no spiritual power at all, and it is the church minister that is the head of the church and can actually decide. Now the prime minister last year decided just to abolish a holiday, which was called Great Prayer Day. And it's been a big, big controversy in Denmark. And now they sort of want it back. Maybe they want to give it back. So it is the state that is in charge of, church affairs, and that's not good. So I think it is very problematic, and I think Christianity is still what should bind all of Europe together.
So my response to that is, I went on the Tommy Robinson March last September to report it for national radio, and I was intrigued by the people on the march. Some were carrying pennants with Bible verses on them, Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life. People were carrying icons of Christ, images of the saints, St. George flags, all the rest of it. And the challenge that I was given by the radio station was to ask what was I assumed, or they'd assumed, were Christians, to explain what they were doing there. And I asked the same question of everybody, how you explain your presence here when you meet your black or Asian brother or sister in Christ at church tomorrow, because over half of all Christians in London are black or Asian. And I was really intrigued by the different responses. To the young man carrying the pennant with the Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life on his on the Bible verse, he said, "Well, I'm not going to be at church tomorrow." I kind of thought, that's fine. He worships God in his bedroom or wherever. So I asked him the next question, "But you're a Christian, right?" And he said, "Well, no, I'm not." I was kind of, what? And of the third of the people I interviewed, a third said the same thing. They were carrying these icons, carrying these banners, carrying these, Bible verses on pennants. It wasn't even like they were being ambiguous. Some were cultural Christians, others were active Christians. And I began to ask myself the question, where does this idea of Christian nationalism get? There was a moment when the phrase, "he's a lefty," was shouted out, and I got chased and punched. It was a difficult setup, and I had to leg it through the crowd. But I wanted to reflect, and I've been reading a book called Chosen Peoples by Anthony D. Smith. And he actually says this phrase nationalism, and I'll just quote it actually. Sacred belief, he says, is central to national identity, even in a secular, globalized world. And he says actually that it is religious belief itself from which we originate the idea of nationhood. The earliest use of the term nationalism in the English language, Professor Smith says, appeared during the mid-19th century to express the doctrine of the divine election of a nation. Indeed, Victorian Britain's imperial mission was, from one angle, mainly an extension of this belief in national chosenness. So we ought to take away from the Robinsons or the Lows of this world who have described forms of ethno-nationalism. Actually, I want to qualify Robinson. He doesn't say that, but you might argue that Low does. By saying that underneath it is a sense of the sacred, let's interrogate what that means and hold them to account for it.
I have no problem with Christian nationalism as a term. In the heart of contemporary debates, we have got these two fundamental questions about the rejection of faith and the rejection of nationhood, and what you can feel in the European political trends, the strengthening of patriotism and conservatism, and this Christian revival is the re-emergence of the importance of both, of faith and nationhood. And I believe that they are also important to reflect to each other. If we look at our Christian faith, it is not without, even in the Bible, even in the Old Testament, it is not without the partiality of national identity. Jesus was crying for Jerusalem, wasn't he? Or the chosen people in the Old Testament reflect how important it was. But at the same time, we could see that this partiality was not without universalism at the same time. Yeah. And because obviously whole Christianity and the New Testament is about that kind of universalism of Christ and redemption. This is from that perspective, that how we relate to each other, the two, is important, because it is not Christianity plus nationalism, but the nationalism should be Christian, and our Christianity should be open to the values of nationhood and universalism at the same time. So I think it is very important that we relate the two concepts to each other, and we reflect openness. When the contemporary major global debates we are identifying, end of international law, unilateralism of the United States, and so on, I think this is also very important to look at Christianity as something which keeps together our civilization. It is not just the international law what keeps us together, but the heart of the international law, as we understand it, reflected in the UN Charter, we have got Christianity as the heart of it. So I believe that for the answer is not just repeating the importance of international law, but let's go deeper and beyond. Thank you.
Can we have some more questions, please? I see Rod has his hand up here.
Use that. Hi, one of the most important things I've ever heard about politics was said by Prime Minister Viktor Orban. He said that people look to politicians for meaning. He said, but politics can't give us meaning. He said, I'm a politician, I can give you things, by which I took him to mean laws, subsidies, things like that. He said, the institutions that do give meaning, churches, schools, arts organizations, families, and so forth, if they don't step into the public space opened up by politics and do their job, then anything that politics might accomplish for the good won't last. Now, I think of that all the time, because so many people today think that restoring the culture is simply a matter of voting the right people in, and that's clearly not the case. I'd like the panel to reflect on Prime Minister Orban's point about the relationship between politics and meaning, and other institutions needing to step up and do their work of proclaiming meaning, revealing meaning, and forming souls.
Who wants to go first? No, let's do it. Well, Viktor Orban, I have to.
Speak for him.
You know, with Viktor Orban, we have. Do I need this or not, Jonathan?
You're fine with the radio. Yeah.
I don't need it.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So, Viktor Orban, we have established Fidesz in 1988 together. A few of us, and as you know, he is Prime Minister of Hungary for 16 years, and we have become a kind of laboratory in the past 16 years, how to put into reality these ideas that you have just developed. And as you said, these kind of commitment to create favorable conditions. Let's talk about the churches, just to narrow down your question to this aspect. At the end of communism in Hungary, there was no church education because the communists have terminated and nationalized all church institutions in 1945. And that happened behind the Iron Curtain everywhere. In the past decades, we have been able to return the schools to churches. And now over 20% of the Hungarian public education is in church institutions. It couldn't be more because that was the ability of the churches to take back these institutions. But I have to tell you that my kids, I'm a Protestant, my kids went to a Catholic church because there was no Protestant church in the neighborhood, the school in the neighborhood, but 3 times as many kids are applying for the church schools than the state ones. So this probably is a good example what I'm talking about. In my congregation, in a district of Budapest, my local community, the local Protestant church, a couple of years ago decided that, okay, let's move into this service. And now they have created 2 new kindergartens, 1 elementary school, and 1 high school. And now over 1,000 kids study in these 4 institutions, maintained by a small Protestant congregation of 400 people, because this is not a big church. 400 taxpayers are there. But what the state did was very important, because the state decided that that kind of subsidy which is given to the state schools is going to be given to the church schools as well. And in this regard, there is a full equality how the state and the church institutions are treated by the state. And this was the precondition for this, because otherwise the financial conditions wouldn't exist. So these were 2 examples how I think this can be put into practice, what Viktor Orbán said on a theoretical level. Thank you.
To answer the question, I think that Viktor needs to continue to do more work in his catechism and in his thinking. The model of the Hungarians are pursuing is commendable, and the Hungarian constitution is of great interest. But in its conceptual framework, it still rules according to the human, or even I might say liberal understanding of government. What I mean by that is that it's not a transcendent constitution. It's a means of transfer of ideas. But the human transfer of ideas is not part of the English covenantal or even biblical model. If Professor Oliver O'Donovan was here, he might remind us, or I might invite him to remind us, of what he wrote in Desire of the Nations, page 82. He says that we need to see politics as the theatre of the divine self-disclosure. The theatre of the divine self-disclosure. That accounts for, and I'm grateful that the Reverend Helen Orr picked us up on this in her intervention yesterday when she spoke about the possibility of divine intervention in human affairs. And it's that politicians should be reaching out for. So although I welcome the English and indeed the Hungarian transmissions of the mechanisms of the transfer of values or ideals, including Christian ones, it's something deeper and more profound that's required at this moment, and I think which Iben actually in her presentation was touching upon. The idea of God responding to human volition by means of blessing, the covenantal model, or by means of discipline, also the covenantal model. And I would pass the mic now to my Dutch friend to introduce us to perhaps say a few comments about a Calvinist way of looking at this as well, because the Dutch, in many ways, have modeled this.
Let's see if this works first. Well, yes, although I'm Catholic myself, but I wasn't really sure about, yeah.
Respect.
But I think, specifically in Calvinist countries, we seem to have this strange religion without God that is overtaken politics. I think we're in a kind of hyper-political age. in the sense that I find that the Christian tradition, the Christian politicians, the Christian parties are the least religious in their political manifestations compared to all the other parties. Because for as a Christian Democrat, for example, you tend to view politics as, okay, we'll have to balance all these different interests and values and come up with something where we all agree on something. It's a pragmatic approach in this sense to politics. Sorry about that. I don't know what's going on. But yeah. But on the other hand, you see from the left, there's all these political religions coming in now. So politics has become dominated by, it's more about, it's religious emotions that take over. So it's about an enemy and a friend. It's about regarding the other as pure or impure. It's like saying, I am the good person, you are a bad person, you are wrong. So it's all these religions and emotions are everywhere now, and this is and particularly among with the withdrawal of actual Christianity from politics.
Yeah, I would like to ask a counter question. Because is it really the role of the state or institutions to bring this formation? I think it actually starts in the family. And the biggest problem in European civilization is that families are so broken. In 2 weeks, we have an election, or the next election in Denmark, and now, of course, following the campaign. And Danes are like small kids. They want the states to take care of all their affairs. For instance, we have a huge mental crisis among our young children and young adults. And everybody, all parents say, it is the system that has failed. The system has failed us. So, you know, the young people, they learn it's not mom and dad who's going to help me, it is the system. And the system is being asked to provide something it cannot provide. So I think actually the responsibility starts in the family, and that is the biggest problem. And I think, for instance, in Denmark, the reason why so many people get divorced, every second marriage in Denmark ends in a divorce. And that's because the state provides, so you don't need a partner anymore. A woman today can get a child with the state because she can go to any clinic and get inseminated and get a child, and the state will pay for it. She doesn't need a man. And that's a huge problem because when the families are broken, if you see that the family is the image of the Trinity, the mother, the father, and the child, there is something in our relationship with God that is broken because the family is so broken. And I'm sorry, because I know a lot of you might be divorced, and I'm not judging you. I'm just saying that our culture is deeply sick because the family is so broken.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I promised despotic timekeeping, and I will hold myself to that promise, because I'm aware that lots of you will be looking forward to your lunch break. But can we please finish by thanking our panel for their excellent talks? Jonathan Price is now going to say a few words, thanking you all for coming and letting you know about more things happening at Pusey.
Thank you so much. We will liberate you from this revival meeting to go out in the world and to do the good work and to spread the faith in a moment. But just before that, for those of us who are joining, Pusey House from time to time offers a safe space. Not only in that sense, but in the original sense of a space where conversations can be had that are hard to have elsewhere. And some British politicians, along with some friends from Europe, some national journalists and others, are going to continue speaking about this in the afternoon in closed quarters, where they might decide to become friends, to be friendly with one another, and to do things. So not a conspiracy, but a co-spiracy. That's a new word. There we are. So Christians coming together and asking, what can we do for the national life of Britain in a place where it's safe to speak about it openly with one another, and we're providing that. We've provided it in the past to academics, and even from time to time to some of the bishops within the Church of England who've asked us for that kind of space, and we're happy to do that. Lunch for those joining is provided, and for the staff of Danube and Pusey in the hood room just after this. The next conference like this, that is large-scale, all-in, multi-day, will be the 17th through the 19th of June, and that will be on natural law and war. but importantly, it will also be on the harder thing, which is not just war, but just peace. So do come out for that. That will be members of the academy, it will be military chaplains, it will be representatives of various military organizations, it will be those who supply troops with things they need, it will be people like you and me. So that will be open to the public like this, 17th through the 19th of June here. We have a lot going on next term. Our term card should be published next week. Father George, I don't want to say this with in the weeks to come, our term card will be released on the website with a lot going on next term, including conferences that you can already book, such as What Makes a Novel Christian? With some novelists and those, like myself, aspiring novelists, right? We have a story to tell. Come out and see if we can tell it in the Christian Register. That being said, this has been recorded. Videos of it will show up online on the Danube website and on Pusey's YouTube in the coming weeks. If you want to send that out to anyone far and wide, please do. And check out our poll, which is still fresh. It's showing up in different places, that Britain is unwilling to become more secular and maybe is curious to maintain its Christian legacy and heritage within the Constitution. With that being said, on behalf of Father George, the trustees of Pusey House, the chapter, the greater chapter, the Danube Institute, and all of us, thank you for being here, and we hope to see you very soon. We are open every day for worship. Thank you.